Alien Romulus is finally here. I recently did the timeline for Alien, so now I figured it'd be a good time to review the whole series, culminating in my recap and review for Romulus. Alien began with a deceptively simple premise. What if a dangerous alien got aboard your spaceship? But there was clearly something special about it, because out of that 1979 film, there grew a whole universe that just got its newest entry in almost 50 years. Aside from this latest sidequel, Alien previously got 3 sequels, 2 prequels, 2 crossovers, a supposedly completed but unfortunately canned animated crossover series, an upcoming live-action show, and that's just talking about the film and TV side. There are also video games, books, and comics, which further expand the mythology, including the upcoming Aliens vs. Avengers. I doubt Ridley Scott or anyone else saw that coming back in '79. Today, I'm recapping and reviewing every Alien movie in release order, like I said, ending with Romulus. And I'm just focusing on the Alien movies. No Alien vs. Predator, though I may cover those at a later date when I get to the Predator movies. I'll keep the recaps brief, but check out the timeline if you want more detail. And now, let's start with 1979's Alien. But first, as a content creator whose profession relies on the internet, I'm a big fan of this place. But you and I both know the internet can also be scary, especially when it comes to privacy. For example, did you know that your personal data is sold online by data brokers? Corporations that collect huge amounts of personally identifiable information then sell it. They get this info from places like government public records or social media, and once they have it, anyone can buy your personal details through people search websites, background check sites, marketing research agencies, and more, which puts you at a higher risk of getting doxxed, harassed, or targeted for identity theft and scams. So what can you do about all this? Personally, I recommend Delete Me. If you sign up for their service, Delete Me experts will find and remove your personal information from tons of search engines and data broker sites. I recently subscribed myself, and 7 days later, I received my first privacy report, where I can see that they reviewed 1,645 listings, removed 93 which contained my personal info, and they're working on another 83. For those in progress, I can see how long it'll be before my info is taken down, and Delete Me's privacy advisors will go back and check to ensure it got done. I want to thank Delete Me for sponsoring this video, and if you want to protect your personal data today, you can get 20% off Delete Me US consumer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/onetake and use promo code ONETAKE at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/onetake, code ONETAKE. Now, back to the video. The year is 2122. Humanity now reaches the stars. The commercial towing vehicle Nostromo is on a return trip to Earth, carrying 20 million tons of mineral ore and a crew of 7, including Warrant Officer Ellen Ripley, all currently in hypersleep, so the trip should pass by in a blink. But the ship's computer, Mother, wakes them up early, halfway to home. Most of the crew are unhappy, except Science Officer Ash. The reason they stopped is of great interest to him. Mother picked up a signal that is not of natural origins. It seems to have been sent by intelligent life, and their contract stipulates that such signals must be investigated. They land on the moon where it's coming from, LV-426. A team of 3 leave to investigate, while Ripley and Ash stay on the ship. That team does find signs of intelligent life, an extraterrestrial craft, its long-dead pilot with a hole in its chest, and they find eggs. When Kane gets too close to one of them, something bursts out of it, a spider-like creature with appendages like long fingers it uses to grip Kane's skull hard and plant itself firmly on his face. They rush back to the Nostromo, where Ripley makes a tough call. She cannot allow Kane aboard. Whatever he's infected with could put them all in danger. But it seems Ash is willing to pay that price in the name of science. He disobeys the order and lets him on. At the infirmary, they try to cut the facehugger off, but its apparent acid blood makes that a bad idea. Instead, they wait. and soon it leaves Kane. After that they find it dead, but they soon learn it only died because its job was done, planting the embryo. Kane wakes up and the team is in high spirits, until a small monster bursts out of his chest. It scurries away, only showing itself again once its impossibly rapid maturation process is done. Now it is larger and stronger than anyone aboard the Nostromo. Brett is the first to die, then Captain Dallas, in a failed attempt to drive it into the airlock where it could be blasted into space. With him gone, Ripley takes charge, and as the new captain, she speaks with Mother. That's when she finds out about the company, Weyland-Yutani's secret. The Nostromo did not simply happen upon a signal. The company sent them here to collect a specimen for their bioweapons division. Ash has been ordered to ensure its retrieval. All other considerations are secondary. Crew expendable. He tries to kill Ripley to stop her from telling the others, until Parker and Lambert arrive to stop him instead. That's when they find out he is a machine, a synthetic sent to complete a mission without the impediment of morals. Now Ripley opts for Plan B. She and the two other survivors will leave on the escape shuttle and blow up the Nostromo. But soon it is only her and Jonesy, the crew's pet cat. Parker and Lambert head off to grab the coolant and don't make it back. Ripley sets the ship to self-destruct and escapes on the shuttle as the Nostromo explodes behind her, only to realize they have a guest on board. The xenomorph hid itself among the vessel's wires and tubes. Ripley hides in a closet, quietly puts on a suit, and straps in before opening a doorway. The alien holds on as rapid decompression threatens to force it into the void of space. Ripley fires her grappling hook, knocking it off the ship until it finds its way back. Finally, by activating the thrusters, she pushes the xenomorph away, leaving it to die in that void. At last, Ellen Ripley, sole survivor of the Nostromo, leaves her final report, sets a course toward Earth, and enters cryosleep, hopeful that once she reaches the frontier in 6 weeks, someone will find her and pick her up. I should mention, by the way, Jonesy the cat is also in cryosleep and doing just fine. I think if it were otherwise, people might not have been so warm to the idea of a continuing franchise. But anyway, why did people want to revisit this world so bad? What was it that made the movie so special? Before I dive into the review, I'll quickly mention that I already sort of reviewed this movie last year in my What Alien Is Really About video. That was more focused on the themes of the movie rather than a straight-up review, but a lot of what I said there, I'll be repeating here. So if you just watched that video recently, feel free to skip ahead to Aliens. So what is it that makes Aliens so special? Like most stories, it starts with getting the basics right. In any movie, the stakes tend to feel higher when the world feels real. The more you believe in what's happening, the more you care and feel the emotional journey. In some ways, that's harder to pull off in sci-fi horror, where the plot depends on things happening that are far outside the ordinary. H.P. Lovecraft, the godfather of cosmic horror, wrote about this issue, saying how inconceivable events in fiction are handicapped by their incredibility. But, he explained, this can be overcome through realism in every other aspect of the story, something Ridley Scott clearly took to heart. When the crew of the Nostromo wake from hypersleep, they talk over a meal and they talk over each other.
Give some cornbread.
The movie doesn't give each character a turn to get their word in like a scripted scene. Instead, we're like a fly on the wall of real, messy conversation. They complain about the food and their pay, they make fun of each other, they curse. The phrase space truckers is often associated with this movie because most of the main characters are not scientists of the year 2122. They are not part of a privileged few who explore the outer reaches of space and use sci-fi jargon that would further propel this movie into fantasy. They are ordinary citizens who talk like us. They are something familiar and real to help Alien overcome the incredibility of the xenomorph, the facehuggers, and that ancient derelict ship. The space setting also sidesteps an often unrealistic horror trope. Think of any ghost story where you wonder why the characters don't just leave the haunted house. Aliens reply to that: what if the haunted house is floating in space? All this is especially important in horror. The more we believe in what's happening, the more we fear the ghost, ghoul, or alien. And once you have the foundation of a grounded reality, you can take the viewers on a strange and bizarre journey. That's where Alien's special ingredients come in. H.P. Lovecraft also wrote that the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. And that's logical. Knowledge alleviates fear because it tells us how to alleviate risk. When our ancient ancestors first encountered wolves or lions and didn't realize their speed or strength, it must have been terrifying. Now we know we're safe if we take shelter and put a wall between us and it. But if we encounter an extraterrestrial, maybe it's smart enough to open doors, or maybe it has acid blood and can melt the walls between us. The unknown means incalculable risk, and when it presents itself as a threat, our minds sound the same alarms that rang millions of years ago at the sight of an unknown predator. Lovecraftian or cosmic horror attempts to push this idea to its limit, confronting us with not just the unknown, but the unknowable and inconceivable. At these limits, we discover a new kind of fear, that we know vastly less than we thought. That we are insignificant in a universe that is worse than malevolent. It's indifferent. In Alien, the crew discovers a crashed ship, something that must have been flown by an unknown yet advanced species. But they are not the antagonists of the story. They are long-dead victims of the same entity which Ripley and the others will soon face. This is where Alien most embraces cosmic horror, because more frightening than finding a hostile alien species is finding two that are hostile to one another, and we are just caught in the middle. Throughout all of history, humanity places itself as protagonists in the grand story. We are the only known creatures who think, build, and advance our species. We are the ones who make history. But this crashed ship on LV-426 displaces us. If there's a story being told, humanity is joining long after the credits rolled on the story of whatever piloted that ship. It looks vaguely humanoid, but substantially larger, and it almost looks like it's part of the ship itself. A strange melding of biology and technology. It's an appropriately intimidating and strange presence. Of course, Prometheus later removes much of this mystery, but taking Alien on its own terms, this strange ship and its pilot tug on the same fears Lovecraft reached for in so many of his stories. When the facehugger grafts itself to Kane's face, there is an element of familiarity. Its appendages look like fingers with knuckles. We can imagine what it would feel like wrapped around our heads. And we recall some of our everyday fears, like when you feel an itch on your arm and find a spider. Now imagine it's on your face. Your entire face, and there's no way to remove it. Like the movie itself, there's a balance in this creature between the familiar and the unknown. Maybe we can imagine what this thing would feel like on our faces, but what the hell is it doing to Kane? Eating him? Living off him like a parasite? The known is the doorway that allows us to accept this story, so the unknown can terrify us. Finally, that big scene happens. Dan O'Bannon's original screenplay for the movie was changed substantially before production, but the scene which got the attention of producers Walter Hill and David Giler, and convinced them it was a movie worth making, the scene which stayed in all their subsequent rewrites, was the chestburster scene. Unfortunately, it's impossible to watch today and be surprised by it. But so much of horror is finding ways to show us something we haven't seen before. And in 1979, an alien bursting out of someone's chest was on that list. It also plays on other familiar fears, the violation of something foreign and parasitic inside you. And as humans, we are so much more than warm bodies. We think, feel, and create. But in the cosmic story being told, we are reduced to one-time use incubators. The unknown is scary, and when the unknown is so big it makes us feel insignificant, fear can turn into an almost existential dread. This movie is often praised for the little screen time actually given to the xenomorph, only about 4 minutes worth. Quick glimpses of the alien reveal elements from creatures we know. It sheds its skin like a reptile. It has something resembling a scorpion's stinger. It's slimy like something out of the ocean, and sometimes it appears almost humanoid, especially in those rare glimpses where we see its entire body. H.R. Giger's incredible design brings these disparate elements together into something that feels like a cohesive organism. The familiar elements help it feel like something which might exist, but the bizarre collection of parts, including the mouth within a mouth, make it feel so alien at the same time. It's that same balance again, helping the impossible feel possible. This is also helped by Ridley Scott's choice of limiting the xenomorph screen time. It's shown often enough to feel like a real presence, but shrouded enough to remain in that place where it tugs on our fear of the unknown. It also builds that sense of dread. We're never quite sure when it'll show up, and every time it does, someone dies. So we wait, fearing its next inevitable appearance. Except in this one moment. This will never not look kind of goofy to me, because here, it really does just look like a guy wearing a tail. There's also the jazz hands moment when the alien gets Dallas, but I have to admit, it happens so fast it's never something I noticed, but now that it's been pointed out to me, I can't unsee it. The alien does jazz hands, and it looks pretty goofy. We also have to talk about Ash. It's easy to forget the first time you watch this movie, you don't know he's a synthetic. It's a twist that works so well because it's unexpected, yet suddenly makes perfect sense. It explains why he let Kane back on board, why when Ripley suggested they get rid of the dead facehugger, he insisted on keeping the specimen. And Dallas revealed earlier that Ash is not his usual science officer, but a replacement recently provided by the company. I love how the reveal is done. For a moment, you see white liquid dripping down his forehead, your first real hint he may not be exactly what he seems. He tries to kill Ripley by shoving a magazine down her throat. I'm not sure why he deemed that the most efficient method, but it does somehow feel like more of a violation than a more traditional attack, which fits with this movie's brand of horror. Once the others help Ripley fight him off, he goes nuts and starts spewing up more of the white fluid. Finally, they knock his head off. This reminded me of some research I did for my analysis of The Shining. In that movie, Kubrick and his writing partner Diane Johnson used Sigmund Freud's essay, The Uncanny, as basically a manual for how to frighten people. One of the first examples Freud talks about as a surefire way to achieve the uncanny is to blur the lines between animate and inanimate. You want a reader to question if an object, like a doll, might actually be alive, or vice versa. Maybe that person isn't really a person. Freud quotes from psychiatrist Ernst Jentsch, one of the few who previously tackled this subject at the time. He talked about how you want to leave the object or person's true nature in doubt as long as possible, so the reader can experience that sensation of the uncanny the whole time. In the Ash sequence, I think Ridley Scott does a good job drawing things out for a few minutes, before the ultimate, grotesque, and violent reveal. This movie also paints what I believe is an accurate picture for how AI might be abused in the future. It will be a way for people to do awful things without getting their hands dirty. They can state their desire, tell the AI that it's a priority, then let it make the awful, immoral choices to get it done. No one at Weyland-Yutani has to kill Ripley. They only have to type into a computer, "crew expendable," then let the robot go to work. Finally, we get his swan song. They turn him back on in search of answers, but all he has to offer is despair.
There's gotta be a way of killing it. How? How do we do it?
You can't. You still don't understand what you're dealing with, do you? Perfect organism. Its structural perfection is matched only by its hostility.
You admire it.
I admire its purity. A survivor, unclouded by conscience, remorse, or delusions of morality. I can't lie to you about your chances, but you have my sympathies.
It's a great finish to Ian Holm's fantastic performance, and it acts as a hype speech for the rest of the movie. It tells us just how low the odds are for our heroes. It raises the stakes. Speaking of heroes, rewatching the movie, I'm always surprised by how long it takes for it to become clear Ripley is the survivor of this group. In the first act, the focus is mostly on the group as a whole, and to some extent Dallas. It's understated in a way that fits the movie's naturalistic tone. Heroes don't reveal themselves until a situation calls for action or a difficult choice, like whether or not to let Kane back on board, or how to handle the facehugger specimen once it's dead, and what to do about the monster that's apparently joined them on the Nostromo. These are the moments where Ripley reveals her qualities as a survivor. The unknown means incalculable risk. The proper response is caution. Abide by quarantine protocol. Do not let Kane back on board. Once the facehugger dies, she wants to get rid of it because who knows if it has any other tricks up its sleeve, like that unexpected acid blood. Ash insists on keeping it, and Dallas leaves it up to him. That's when we see Ripley's courage. She is willing to stand up to leadership and challenges Dallas on his call. We see more of that bravery when she is the first to volunteer to go into the air ducts after the xenomorph, before Dallas insists it should be him. When Lambert and Parker panic, she is the one who insists on thinking through their next move rationally. Like Ash, we realize he's a synthetic and look back to see it fits all his previous actions. With Ripley, we watch her defeat the xenomorph, then look back and see she's shown heroic qualities all along, but she is not the action hero you'd expect. It's never pushed so far that she becomes extraordinary. That would break the spell of this movie. In the end, she's still a space trucker, someone ordinary we can relate to, but now also look up to. Sigourney Weaver played her to perfection. Of course, people would want to see more of her and this world. There had to be a sequel. But before we get there, I have to mention that famous tagline, "In space, no one can hear you scream." Obviously, brilliant marketing, which conjures a feeling of isolation that can definitely be felt in the movie itself. The entire story is spent far from Earth, mostly on a ship in the void of space. The closest we get to a planet is a planetoid, a fancy word for a planet-like thing, in this case a moon. Most of the Alien movies have treated Earth in mysterious terms. It's the future, so we don't know the state of Earth. If Ripley were to go home, would it feel like the home we know today, or is it something totally different? That question has always created for me not just a sense of mystery, but it also makes this whole world feel even more alien. Something helped tremendously by Jerry Goldsmith's score. It's not the kind of music you'll hum, it's much more focused on feeling. Sometimes it'll have a couple of repeating notes that give the sensation of approaching some mystery, building a dreadful sense of curiosity. At other times it devolves into a cacophony of strings to amplify the audience's discomfort, like at the space jockey reveal. It's a great movie and one that's impossible to do a traditional review for, because you just end up repeating things that have been said thousands of times over the last 45 years. But hopefully I've helped to shed light on what's made it special to me over the years. And I wish I could erase my memory of it and watch it again for the first time. But I can't, so instead, let's watch the sequel, 1986's Aliens. The year is 2179. 57 years ago, Ellen Ripley went into cryosleep. A few weeks later, she drifted right through the core systems. Now, thanks to blind luck, she is discovered by a deep salvage team. But when she wakes, her old life is gone. Her daughter died 2 years ago at age 66, and she is stripped of her ICC license after blowing up a $42 million spaceship. Her crazy stories of a facehugger and alien fall on deaf ears, until Weyland-Yutani loses contact with the colony they built on LV-426. Over 60 families have been living there, with a derelict vessel full of alien eggs in their backyard. Now it seems the two have finally met. Company rep Carter Burke recruits Ripley as an advisor, and soon they join a group of Marines on LV-426. Overconfident Marines who give little credence to Ripley's warnings. At first, they find the colony empty, save for a little girl who goes by Newt. Then they find the other colonists, cocooned in an alien nest, most already dead, the others begging for it, and they find the xenomorphs, a lot more than the one Ripley met. They are just as she described. Most of the Marines are slaughtered, while Lieutenant Gorman freezes up. Ripley is the one who drives in on the APC and rescues the few survivors. Now, Ripley suggests they get back to their ship waiting in orbit and nuke this place to smithereens. Company man Carter Burke protests, but with Gorman unconscious from the earlier battle, Corporal Hicks is in command. He says they go with Ripley's plan. But there's a xenomorph on the dropship. It kills the pilot. The dropship crashes, meaning they are stranded until they're declared overdue and someone comes to the rescue. 17 days from now. Some panic, while Ripley and Hicks stay focused and think strategy. They seal every entrance they can, leaving only 2 points of entry for the xenomorphs, and those are to be guarded by their robot sentry units, unmanned automatic machine guns. As they await the inevitable attack, Ripley has a case of déjà vu. Once again, this mission is not as it seemed. Once again, the company hopes to obtain a facehugger specimen for their bioweapons division. Burke was meant to ensure it happens. And not only that, all this was his fault. After Ripley told her story of the derelict craft and the eggs, Burke sent colonists to investigate. It's his fault they were infected and the colony overrun. Ripley makes it clear she will not let him get away with it. Soon, more bad news. Reported by the team's synthetic Bishop, the atmospheric processor has been damaged, a combination of the Marines' firing and the acid blood during the first attack, and damage caused by the dropship crash. In 4 hours, the processor will go nuclear. Their only hope is for someone to go outside and repair the hard wiring between here and the transmitters. Then they could call for the other dropship remotely. Ever since Ash, Ripley's had a distrust of synthetics. But this particular synthetic volunteers to go, putting himself in harm's way for the team's benefit. While he works, the xenomorphs stage their assault. The sentry guns work, but now they are nearly out of ammo, and the aliens will look for another way in. In the meantime, after over 24 hours with no sleep, Ripley joins Newt for some shut-eye. Until she's attacked by a facehugger. She quickly sets off the fire alarm. Hicks and the other Marines come to the rescue just in time, and she tells them what really happened. Burke was behind this. They had facehuggers in the lab, and he set them free, hoping they'd impregnate Ripley and Newt. Then, with aliens gestating inside them, he could stick them in cryosleep and sneak the specimens through ICC quarantine, safely hidden in their unwilling human hosts. Before Hicks can execute Burke for the attempted double homicide by alien parasite, the xenomorphs find that way in. They cut the power to the facility, and they come in through the ceilings. Only Ripley, Hicks, and Newt survive this latest assault, until Newt falls and is taken by the monsters. By now, Bishop has grabbed the dropship, but Ripley will not leave until she finds Newt, and she'll have to do it alone. Hicks was hurt by the alien's acid blood and is in no condition to go back out there. Ripley does find Newt in the alien nest, thanks to a tracker she gave the girl earlier, but on their way out, they run into the Queen, the alien in charge, the one who lays the eggs. Ripley burns her eggs, riddles her with bullets, and gets back to the surface. But the Queen learns to work the elevator. She's right behind them, until Bishop arrives on the dropship. They get back to their main vessel in orbit. Ripley thanks Bishop, just before the Queen rips him in half. The Queen apparently snuck onto their dropship, and now it's here. But once Ripley gets into an exosuit cargo loader, it's a fair fight, and she gives that Queen the usual xenomorph treatment, tossing it into the airlock and launching it into space. Ripley puts the wounded but still living Hicks into cryosleep, then does the same for Newt, and finally, herself. Time to go home.
I'll never say that Aliens is a better movie than Alien. They're both classics, so why even try to rank one over the other? But I will say Aliens is the one I'm most likely to revisit. The thing with horror is that it often works best when it's unknown. And now in the year 2024, I've not only seen Alien many times, but I've had years of exposure to the facehuggers and the xenomorph. I've seen that bizarre looking space jockey on the derelict is really just a big blue guy in a weird suit with an elephant helmet. I've seen a million pop culture references, including spoofs and parodies.
Hello, my baby. Hello, my honey.
So sadly, it is hard to be scared by Alien the way I was the first time I saw it. Aliens, on the other hand, is less sci-fi horror and more sci-fi action with a splash of horror. That pivot comes from the wider scope and larger cast, reducing the overall feeling of isolation. It comes from having Marines in the movie, not only trained to kill, but also equipped with the weapons to do it. As a result, things don't feel quite as hopeless or uneven against the xenomorphs. Sure, most of those Marines are quickly wiped out, and that is effective at raising the stakes and lowering the odds of survival, but not in a cosmic dread sort of way. More of a time to watch Ripley and Hicks team up and figure a badass way out of this mess kind of way. I mean, the climax of the movie has Ripley fist fighting a giant alien using a robot exoskeleton. It's just hard to be horrified when that sort of thing is going on. And I'm not complaining. It's just a different flavor of movie. Like I said, in some ways, it even makes the movie more timeless than its predecessor. Not only is it less dependent on unfamiliarity, it also just makes for a more pleasant viewing experience. You don't have to be in the mood for horror to watch. You can just be in the mood for a thrill ride with that James Cameron patented heart. Aliens is the Terminator 2 of the Alien franchise. Not only is it a sequel that emphasizes horror less than its predecessor, but it's also a story where a parent-child-like relationship forms the personal stakes of a larger sci-fi action plot. In T2, you had John Connor growing closer with a surrogate father in the T-800. In Aliens, you have Newt growing closer with a surrogate mother in Ellen Ripley, made all the more poignant in the special edition, which restores the scene of Ripley asking about her daughter. That's when we find out that she had a daughter, and before leaving on the Nostromo, promised she'd be back in time for her 11th birthday. Instead, Ripley wakes up 57 years later to the news her daughter has already passed at the age of 66. Of course, that relationship can never be replaced, but with Newt, she forms a bond that is something like the relationship between a mother and daughter. And Newt is going through something similar. She lost her entire family. A family we actually meet in the special edition. We see they were the first colonists to go explore the derelict. Newt's parents head in, and a few minutes later her dad comes back wearing a facehugger. I can see why it was cut. The scene doesn't really add anything. It's so brief, it's not like we get to know her family at all. It feels more like a way to bring some of the action closer to the start of the movie. The way horror movies often have an early kill unrelated to the main character. A way to give you a taste of what's ahead and make sure you know the danger that lurks. But Aliens is a sequel. Once we hear the colony's built on LV-426, we already know the danger. We even get a reminder at the Court of Inquiry when the Weyland-Yutani suits grill Ripley about what happened. And in terms of getting to the action, Ripley's dream sequence in the first few minutes already kind of does that. Either way, we have an idea what's coming, but there's enough uncertainty that there's a dread imagining what they'll find on LV-426. We've seen one xenomorph in action, but the company has lost contact with the entire colony. Clearly, these monsters have multiplied and slaughtered who knows how many innocent people in the process. Once they arrive, Newt quickly puts a human face to the tragedy. She is traumatized, scared, and grieving. Of course, it takes her time to trust anyone, so it's particularly satisfying when she starts opening up to Ripley and starts looking up to her as a motherly figure. It creates a warmth that was absent in the first movie, contributing to its more horrific tone. In that first movie, the characters felt real, but we didn't get to know any of them all that much, and the relationships between them are pretty static. We don't see people growing closer or more distant. The focus is much more on survival, which I think was appropriate for that movie. In Aliens, the characters are more pronounced. You get a feel for each of them very quickly. Vasquez, she's a badass and very self-aware of that fact. Hicks, calm, collected, takes things seriously, a good partner to Ripley, and played so well by Michael Biehn, Kyle Reese himself. Hudson, played by the late great Bill Paxton, needs no description. He speaks just fine for himself.
That's it, man. Game over, man. It's game over. What the fuck are we gonna do now? What are we gonna do?
There's Burke, who is fun to watch because of how afraid he always looks. You can tell he's terrified of people knowing how slimy he really is, so he's always trying to cover it up. He made the call for the colony to investigate the derelict, effectively sending them to slaughter. He conspires to have Ripley and Newt impregnated by aliens, and to cover it up, intends on sabotaging the rest of the Marines' hypersleep chambers, so only he'd come back alive. These abhorrent acts clash so interestingly with his meek demeanor, and as one of my favorite characters, Bishop, the synthetic. Ripley does not trust him, and outwardly holds his nature against him. In the face of that prejudice, he only remains calm and assuring. I always feel so much sympathy for him in this moment.
Ripley's last trip out, the artificial person malfunctioned.
Malfunctioned?
There were problems, and a few deaths were involved.
I'm shocked. Was it an older model?
Yeah, the Hyperdyne system's 128.2.
Well, that explains it, and the A2s always were a bit twitchy. That could never happen now with our behavioral inhibitors. It is impossible for me to harm, or by a mission of action allow to be harmed, a human being.
He doesn't project so much emotion that it feels totally human, but there's enough that you can tell he really is shocked. And after trying to reassure Ripley, she replies with this.
You sure you don't want some?
Just stay away from me, Bishop. You got that straight?
I feel so bad for him, while at the same time sympathizing with Ripley's view that maybe it's an act. Or maybe Bishop means what he says, but there's a special order in there somewhere. Maybe even he isn't aware of it. Or maybe he'll glitch. But Lance Henriksen brings so much earnestness to the role, you believe it. The characters aren't just more pronounced, but also the relationships between them are dynamic in a way they weren't in Alien. And of course, that's what gives a movie feeling. We don't really notice or care when things are static, but it's change that impacts us. And think of all the change we see in this movie. In the beginning, no one gives Ripley any credit or sympathy for what she survived. The Marines give no heed to her warning, but by the end, the few survivors are looking to her for answers. There is a relationship between Newt and Ripley, becoming something like mother and daughter, or Ripley and Hicks, partnering as they figure out a way to survive. The movie never gets cheesy by making things romantic in the midst of this horrifying life and death situation, but it points ever so slightly in that direction, and it's satisfying to watch them trust each other more and more. And of course, there's Ripley and Bishop. The first time he puts himself in danger to help, you can tell she's skeptical. And how can you not feel terrible for him when he has to worm through this little pipe to get where he needs to make those repairs so they can call the second dropship? It makes me feel so claustrophobic every time I see it. And I imagine how much it would suck if you realized after they weld him in that he got in there facing the wrong way. At the end of the movie, there's the fake-out moment, where Ripley thinks Bishop's abandoned her and Newt, only for him to show up in the nick of time.
Bishop! God damn you!
After that, she finally gives him something resembling a compliment.
You did okay.
I did.
Oh, yeah.
These are the sorts of emotional payoffs you get with dynamic character relationships. We all know the feeling of someone treating you unfairly, judging you based on a person's past experience rather than their experience with you. So to see Ripley put aside her bias and finally accept Bishop is really satisfying. Part of the brilliance of this is that it isn't just a payoff to the relationship between these two characters. It's also the payoff to an incredibly tense action sequence. An alien hive is probably one of the most dangerous locations you can imagine. The only way to make it more dangerous is by putting a nuclear bomb next to it, which is what the atmospheric processor has effectively become. Yet, Ripley goes in there. She gets Newt. There's a great shot of all these explosions around them, so much fire like they are literally in hell. All hope is lost. Until that payoff, with so much emotion baked into it. Ripley and Newt live, and Bishop has proven himself. That whole sequence is just one example of how good James Cameron is at building tension. It's all about anticipation. Sometimes that comes from a literal countdown, like the self-destruct sequence in Alien, or the soon-to-explode atmospheric processor in Aliens. Or sometimes it's a character heading into something you know will be dangerous, like Ripley going into the nest. There's the sentry guns unloading their ammo, leaving us to hope they deter the aliens before they run out. And of course, the movie keeps reminding us how much ammo remains, so we watch it rapidly deplete itself. Now, for all this to work, it can't feel repetitive. And Cameron does a great job stringing together a bunch of unique scenarios that feel like logical steps in the story. It isn't just Ripley versus Xenomorph over and over. There are all the examples I mentioned above, And you can add to that Ripley and Newt versus facehuggers after Burke sets them loose. There's the Marines' first encounter with the xenomorphs, actually our first time in the franchise seeing how guns do against them. And there are a bunch of others. He also finds creative and terrifying ways to add to the xenomorph mythology. The idea of a queen, a nest, something that was actually planned for Alien. There's a deleted scene where during her escape, Ripley finds Dallas cocooned and slowly turning into an egg, and he begs her to kill him. Kill me. It is disturbing. I think even more so than the similar moment in Aliens.
All right, you're gonna be all right. Kill me. Just stay calm. We're gonna get you
My
out.
favorite addition is how Cameron expands on xenomorph intelligence. We see them cut power to the facility, and the Queen figures out how to work an elevator. The idea of those things having thoughts beyond kill, kill, kill is horrifying. But you know what's not horrifying? Newt. I just had to highlight her character before we wrap up with this movie. She's such an important one, and with a child actor, there's always a risk of awkward or overacting. But Carrie Henn did a fantastic job, portraying herself as sullen and traumatized, but at the same time fun, likable, and brave.
Affirmative.
Affirmative.
In the first movie, of course you root for Ripley to survive. But it's a cold world, and in the end, I always feel more relief than triumph. But in Aliens, where we see the warmth between characters, the world feels a little less malevolent. So in the end, in addition to relief, I do feel triumph. Because now in this bleak future, we see something worth living for. She doesn't just avoid death, but also returns from the hell of LV-426, or as I call it, Hell V-426, with a couple of people she cares about. 2.5 people if you account for Bishop's remains. And they live happily ever after. Now, let's watch 1992's Alien 3. In 2179, Ellen Ripley escaped LV-426 with Hicks, Newt, and half of Bishop. None of them noticed the facehugger on board. It causes an electrical fire, so the ship's computer launches them to safety on a nearby planet, Fury 161. One of Weyland-Yutani's backwater work prisons. Only Ripley survives the crash. Well, she is the only human who survives. So does that facehugger. Once they are on the planet, it chooses an ox as its host, and soon a monster bursts out of it. Before the killing starts, Ripley gets to know the prison's chief medical officer, Clemens. He tells her about this place, how it only has 25 prisoners, who recently discovered religion. The company wanted to shut the place down, but these converts insisted on staying, so they were allowed to remain as custodians. Ripley and Clemens feel comfortable around each other. They grow close and even become intimate. Then prisoners start dying. No one knows what's doing it, but the burns make it obvious to Ripley. Acid blood. There's a xenomorph on Fury 161. How could this happen? Ripley plugs in Bishop's remains, and he tells her about the facehugger on board, and he tells her how the ship's data has been sent to Weyland-Yutani. They still want the specimen. Now that they know it's here, they will be coming for it. That's the first piece of bad news. The next comes when Ripley and Clemens share one last quiet moment together, before the xenomorph gets him. But strangely, it shows no hostility toward Ripley. Once it kills Superintendent Andrews too, the desperate prisoners look to Ripley for answers. She helps them devise a plan to lure the monster with explosives. A few of them die in the process, but the plan works. They drive the xenomorph into an unused nuclear waste repository and lock it in. Only for Golic, their resident psychopath, to let it back out. He simply had to see it again. Of course, it becomes the last thing he sees. And more bad news. Ripley hasn't been feeling well. She gets in a neuroscanner and finally sees what's growing inside her. A facehugger must have gotten to her in the stasis pod, and now she carries inside her the next queen. That's why the xenomorph let her go. It knows that she is the future of their species. Now Ripley knows she must die to prevent that future. But first, she helps the prisoners kill that xenomorph. This time, they lure it into the mold, drown it in hot lead, then activate the fire sprinklers, and thermal shock blows it up. Now all that's left is Ripley herself. But Weyland-Yutani has something to say about that. And they're already here. When Ripley put herself in the neuroscanner, the data was uploaded and they expedited their trip. She's met by a man with Bishop's face. Not an android, but the human who designed the android in his own image. The company sent him to show Ripley a friendly face, hoping it would make her more amenable. He tells Ripley to come with them. They have all the equipment they need right here to take the monster out of her. She can live. But Ripley knows damn well what'll happen after that. They won't kill it. They'll study it, weaponize it, and whether they mean to or not, they will unleash hell. The choice they offer is no choice at all. Ripley leaps into the furnace. She dies and takes the xenomorph queen with her.
Remember what I said about all the warmth in Aliens? How good it makes you feel. After Alien 3, I feel traumatized. Actually, that's a lie. I felt traumatized after the first 5 minutes, especially since I watched the assembly cut, so I got to see Hicks' mangled corpse. So many maggots, and I can't stop looking at his teeth. Why did I pause on this frame? Alien 3 is often considered this series' first misstep, and it's up for debate if it ever took another... Actually, what's the opposite of a misstep? According to ChatGPT, a smooth move. So yeah, this is often considered the first misstep, and it's up for debate if the series ever took another smooth move after. Well, we'll find out for ourselves, and I've got my fingers crossed for Romulus. But sticking with 3, David Fincher, the director of the movie, said this about it. I had to work on it for 2 years, got fired from it 3 times, and I had to fight for every single thing. To this day, no one hates Alien 3 more than me. Years later, in 2003, Fox put out the Alien Quadrilogy box set. I vividly remember seeing it as a kid, and that being how I learned the word quadrilogy. For the set, they wanted to include special editions of each movie. Aliens already had the special edition used for home release back in 1991, but for Alien, Alien 3, and Alien Resurrection, they had new versions created. The special editions of Alien and Resurrection were both overseen by each of those movies' directors, adding back deleted scenes and rearranging some other ones. But for Alien 3, Fincher so wanted to distance himself he refused to participate. So instead of a director's cut, we got an assembly cut, overseen by the box set's producer Charles de Lauzirika. To try and capture something close to Fincher's original vision, he worked off an earlier rough cut of the movie from before the studio reworked it. That's the version of the movie I watched for this video and the timeline. It's also generally considered the superior film, and of all the special editions, is the one most drastically different from its theatrical counterpart. I do agree the assembly cut is better, but its fundamental flaws are still there, and although I don't consider it an awful movie, I don't think it's very good either. I agree with Roger Ebert's take. In 1992, he said this was the best-looking bad movie he'd seen in a while. I think David Fincher did a great job directing it, and there are individual scenes that work, but at its core, the story doesn't. The movie starts on that awful note, undoing the happy ending of its predecessor, and it feels so inorganic to Aliens. Like if you imagined that Aliens went on for another 30 minutes, it would be tonal whiplash for it to unceremoniously all of a sudden kill these two characters. I'm not saying it's unrealistic or unbelievable in the fictional world of Alien, but on a meta level, it feels like someone else took over writing and decided to go in an entirely other direction, which of course is exactly what happened. But as a sequel, you probably don't want the audience to feel it. When the movie tells me that Newt and Hicks are dead, my brain, my entire being, rejects the premise. Instead of processing the movie as a sequel, I take it as a standalone story. But I am a firm believer in taking movies on their own terms, so fine, I try not to hold that choice against the movie. Those personal feelings aside, I think the movie actually starts on decent footing. The details of Hicks' disgusting, mangled corpse, we don't linger on it, but we see enough. And the details of how grimy Ripley looks after the crash. It makes all of this feel messy, unglamorous, and un-Hollywood.
it retains the grounded feeling of the previous movies, especially Alien. And when Ripley finds out what happened to Newt and Hicks, the movie gives Sigourney Weaver enough space to show the character grieve. One particularly effective and awful scene is the one where Ripley feels compelled to check Newt's body to see if there's a xenomorph inside her. She cries at the sight of her surrogate daughter and the need to disturb her remains. When she can't find anything just by checking by hand, she insists on an autopsy. The scene doesn't get gratuitous, but it does enough with the sound and quick flashes of the procedure so that you're feeling the same grief and discomfort as Ripley. It also builds tension because you're waiting to find out where that xenomorph is hiding. There's no question it's there because the movie is called Alien 3, but you're waiting for it. The movie also retains some sense of discovery. It's our first time on a planet other than the moon LV-426, and it is a strange place. It's a prison where all the inmates are followers of a religion. We also see at least one new xenomorph trick. It seems oxen make for fine incubators, perhaps even better than humans, because this alien comes out much closer to fully grown than the one in Alien. Or substitute dog for ox if you're talking about the theatrical cut. This creature also runs on all fours, our first indication it borrows DNA from its host. I also found my curiosity piqued by that religious aspect. What does religion look like 150 years in the future, especially in the world of Alien, where we know very little about the state of Earth or human society? Well, it turns out there isn't much to it. The religion of these prisoners is sort of intentionally generic.
Some sort of apocalyptic millenarian Christian fundamentalist.
Right.
Exactly.
And you aren't sure how many are true believers, or how many just wanted an excuse to stay here over a more traditional prison. Then there's the warden, who likes it for the way it helps keep the prisoners in line. On the one hand, the religious aspect is a detail that just adds something to the texture of this world. I think it's also an attempt at satire, showing how religion can be co-opted in different ways, especially by desperate men in desperate situations. On the other hand, it doesn't do a whole lot to drive the plot forward, and ends up feeling more like an excuse to justify why there are so few prisoners here. These are only the few who converted. I don't know if that was a choice to keep the budget down, but that's the feeling I'm left with. It might also be a vestige of previous screenplay drafts, because an earlier version of the script had Ripley landing on a planet of monks. There's a whole story to the messy writing process of this movie, but the long story short is that writer-producers Walter Hill and David Giler were brought in at the end to write the final draft. Previously, they wrote many drafts on Alien, including the final one. They also worked with Cameron on the story for Aliens, and for Alien 3, Sigourney Weaver had it written into her contract that they would take final draft on this movie too. She believed they could best capture her character, but they were short on time. The screenplay borrowed elements from prior drafts, and they actually started shooting without a completed script, something that I am still shocked is allowed to happen so often in Hollywood. So anyway, one reason these prisoners might be religious is that in their old lives, in an old script, they were monks. Ideally, while watching the movie, I should be so engrossed in the story, I'm not thinking about any of this. But one sign that a story isn't fully baked is you start to see the strings pulling it along. Another example is the character of Galek. Hardly a presence in the theatrical cut, but has a bit more to do in the assembly cut. And like the religious aspect, he feels less like an organic addition to the plot and more like one of those strings, put there for a reason. In the theatrical version, he vanishes halfway through the movie. In that version, they also fail to capture the xenomorph in the nuclear waste repository. In the assembly cut, they do capture the xenomorph, and that's when Galek's purpose is revealed. They needed a psychopath to let the monster loose. You could read this as part of that commentary on religious cults. He lets the creature loose to see it one more time, and there is an almost religious fervor behind that need. But in my view, there is not enough done with this aspect for any real exploration of or commentary on the topic. What about the characters and the actual plot once it gets going? Sigourney Weaver does a great job as always, and I enjoyed Charles Dance as Dr. Clemens, Both are fantastic at portraying characters who remain calm and collected while clearly harboring a lot of trauma. I found their budding relationship believable, and it made for a nice contrast to the rest of the movie. The environment on the planet and inside the prison is drab and dark. This is a place devoid of hope, and even less so now that there's a xenomorph hanging around. But in that dark, hopeless place, there is this small spark. You don't want to see it snuffed out. And that's important. Alien already showed us Ripley having to overcome a monster to survive. Aliens avoided repeating itself too much, in part by giving us more characters to care about, and importantly, characters for Ripley to care about. So she is no longer just fighting for survival, but also to save loved ones. With them gone, she's back to square one. But the addition of Clemens at least adds one more thing she'd want to protect and live for. Then, about an hour in, there's an emotional scene where he confesses how he ended up here. He was promising in the field of medicine, but also harbored a secret addiction to morphine. One day, after a 36-hour stretch in the ER, he got drunk, until he was unexpectedly called back to help with 30 casualties from a boiler explosion. 11 of them died when Clemens, with his judgment impaired, prescribed the wrong dosage of painkiller. Despite the difficult confession, Ripley accepts him.
So, do you still trust me with a needle?
It's a great moment, and then it's snuffed out when the xenomorph gets the doctor. It's certainly a surprising moment, and for that, there's some value in it, but the movie also loses something, and that's one step toward how I felt by the end. Empty. Because outside Clemens, there is not much to the other characters. The actors all do a fine job. I especially enjoyed Charles Dutton as the spiritual leader, but the characters are often bombastic in a way that sometimes comes off cartoonish.
Stop this raving at once!
I'm telling you! It's here!
And get that foolish woman back to the infirmary!
They aren't as grounded as the characters in Alien, or as fun or likable as the ones in Aliens. In fact, this movie goes out of its way to remind you most of them are terrible people maybe you shouldn't care all that much about.
All thieves, rapists, murderers, child molesters, all scum.
This man is a convicted multiple murderer known for particularly brutal crimes.
Some even assault Ripley at one point, so I found myself disconnecting from the movie in the second half, especially as the direction of it became clear. There are generally two things that keep me watching a movie: curiosity and hope. By this point in the movie, there wasn't much left for me to be curious about. There isn't much more of the planet to see or anything new to discover about these characters. As for hope, it is quickly fading. The doctor's dead, Ripley is showing signs of illness, and the xenomorph let her live. So I'm starting to catch on where the story is heading. Right before the doctor's death, there was also Bishop's scene, a scene I also thought was really effective, but also contributed to the bleakness telling me there is no hope in this story.
It's very dark here, Ripley. I'm not what I used to be.
He also becomes a sort of metaphor for the state of the franchise during Alien 3, acknowledging he should be dead, but is barely held together with string and glue.
I heard. Do me a favor. Disconnect me. I could be reworked, but I'll never be top of the line again. I'd rather be nothing.
Lance Henriksen continues to do a great job in the role, but his and Clemens' deaths paint a bleak picture. And to be clear, when I say that hope keeps me watching, I'm not saying I need an optimistic or bright movie, but in a sense, I need the movie to at least trick me into believing its characters might succeed. That's what keeps me watching from one scene to the next, the tension of uncertainty. Will the characters make it or not? Once there is certainty, either that they will succeed or in this case won't, tension disappears, and if it happens too long before the end of the movie, I get bored. So I pretty passively watch the characters trap the xenomorph. In the theatrical cut they fail, or in the assembly cut they succeed before it's let out. Then I watch them try again toward the end of the movie, which feels repetitive compared to the earlier attempt, and the final chase sequence takes a while and itself feels repetitive. A lot of running through hallways, something Roger Ebert also complained about. By this point, we've also confirmed Ripley has the xenomorph queen inside her, and she's decided to die. Now, we're no longer meant to hope for her survival, but instead a grander cause, keeping the specimen out of Weyland-Yutani's hands. That does not work for me. Up to this point, not showing Earth has been effective at creating a sense of isolation in space. But now it undercuts the stakes, because I'm supposed to care about the specimen getting out into a world that barely feels like it exists. In the previous two movies, this idea was there. There was a fear of the company turning the monster into a bioweapon, or bringing it home and losing control. But it was not our primary concern. That evil motivation was mainly a way to get Ash and Alien, or Burke and Aliens, to act against our protagonists. That motivation was enough to make their actions believable. But as the main stakes by the end of Alien 3, it's too nebulous for me to care about. By the time Ripley takes her own life, I'm too disconnected to care, and my brain just does not process this as the same character from the last two movies. It just refuses to believe that after Ripley, Hicks, and Newt escape LV-426, this is what happens next. In the end, I think director Fincher and the cast did a good job with a script that needed more time before they turned the cameras on. On the bright side, doesn't it always feel good when you can blame meddling executives rather than anyone on the creative side? Anyway, let's fast forward the story a couple hundred years and see if they can right the ship with 1977's Alien Resurrection. In 2381, the US military picks up where Weyland-Yutani left off, pursuing the alien specimen, and with technology of the 24th century, they can do it. With some of Ripley's blood taken on Fury 161, they clone her, and since the alien DNA mixed with her own before that sample was taken, the clone has the same xenomorph queen growing inside her. The queen lays eggs. The military hires mercenaries to kidnap some hapless test subjects in cryotubes. The eggs hatch. Those test subjects meet facehuggers, and soon the scientists have over a dozen xenomorphs in captivity. But among those mercenaries is a girl named Call, a second-gen synthetic, made not by people but by other machines. Most second-gens were recalled. She escaped, but not before having a look in the mainframe and finding out about the government's plans to resurrect xenomorphs. She joins the mercenaries to sneak on board the military vessel and stop them. But when she finds Ripley, she is too late. They've already taken the queen out of her and made the xenomorphs, who themselves figured out a way to escape. One kills its cellmate, spilling the acid blood to open a makeshift exit. The station becomes a slaughterhouse. The only hope of survival is getting back to the Betty, the mercenaries' ship. Ripley could be a big help. Though they removed the queen, there's still xenomorph DNA inside her. It gives her strength, agility, fast healing, and even acid blood. But it also means she feels some kinship with the creatures. Despite doubts about her allegiance to humanity, the others bring her along. But survival is not their only concern. Once the military vessel detects an emergency, it automatically sets a course for home base, Earth. If they don't stop it, the ship will bring this hell to the rest of humanity. So Call, disgusted by her robotic nature, is forced to embrace it. She plugs into the computer and orders the ship to accelerate upon arrival. So instead of landing on Earth, it'll crash, destroying all the alien organisms on board. They fight their way to the Betty. Some die along the way, but they do make it. Except Ripley, who is grabbed by the xenomorphs, though it's unclear if she's an unwilling captive or glad to be back with her own kind. And soon she reunites with her daughter, the alien queen, and learns that in the genetic crossing, it wasn't just the xenomorph who passed some traits to Ripley, but Ripley also passed at least one to the queen, a human reproductive system. Yes, she has laid eggs, but now, she also has something gestating inside her, and Ripley soon witnesses its birth, a bizarre hybrid, a xenomorph with human eyes. Its screeches are at once alien, but also human. Ripley escapes onto the Betty, only to learn the offspring has followed her. It kills a USM soldier, and then goes after Call, but the hybrid inherently trusts Ripley, its mother.
She uses that against it to get close and to use her own blood to melt a hole in the wall. Depressurization pulls the hybrid against it. It screams as its insides are ripped out. Ripley says she is sorry. Soon, the screaming stops, and the thing is gone. The military vessel crashes to Earth, while the Betty lands safely. Call, an android built in space. Ripley, a clone with genetically inherited memories, step out onto the ruined planet, where they are both strangers, and they wonder what comes next.
It's clear from the start this movie is a major departure from the first three. I obviously wasn't the biggest fan of Alien 3, and it was already a pretty big departure by undoing the previous movie's ending, but tonally at least, it seemed like it was trying to fit in the same world. It was a little less grounded than the first and a little more bleak than the second. But Resurrection finally feels like something entirely different. This one is not attempting to be grounded at all. In its plot, it goes more over the top with a sci-fi element, stretching credulity far beyond anything the series would have allowed previously. The idea is absurd, that they can make a Ripley clone that not only has her memories, but even includes the alien queen inside her. The justification is that when the embryo was put in her, the DNA was mixed between human and alien. But that's obviously a stretch, which would demand more answers if this were to fit next to the more grounded tone of the original. To match the absurd plot, the style of the movie also goes over the top. Look at the standoff between the mercenaries and officers of the US military ship, the way the camera swings around during the fight scene from one person to another, or how this person kills someone by intentionally ricocheting a bullet. The action is way more stylized than the grounded action of Aliens. In fact, I'd say it's specifically stylized to look kind of goofy, and so is a lot of the dialogue.
An unexpected benefit from the genetic crossing.
I see. Stupid me. Of course, an unexpected benefit of the genetic process. How? I didn't even think.
Fork. Fuck. It's fork.
Or have a look at General Martin Perez's eyes when he figures out there's an alien behind him. Maybe the first death played for laughs in this franchise. I personally have no interest in an alien movie with this almost sci-fi action comedy tone, but separating that out, taking the movie on its own terms, I'm still not really a fan. I don't find any of it funny, so for me, all the comedy does is undercut any attempt at actual stakes. Like later in the movie, when Purvis realizes he's dying, so he grabs Ren to make sure the mad scientist goes with him. In one version of the movie, it could be a tragic, heroic moment. In this version, you have Dr. Ren waving his arms around in a really theatrical way before the camera flies into Purvis's mouth. It feels like we're watching a spoof. Sci-fi, horror, and action can definitely blend with comedy successfully, but when it's unsuccessful, you end up rolling your eyes rather than laughing, and it undercuts those other genres, which in this movie is not good because they're already struggling. Similar to Alien 3, I find myself looking for characters to care about. The scientists are evil weirdos only there to justify the return of the monster, and to be killed themselves to up the movie's kill count. The mercenaries are all terrible people who kidnapped innocent people in cryosleep. Sure, they don't know what's happening on the military ship, but they probably have an idea it won't be good for those people they kidnapped. Of course, we can root for morally gray characters. We do it all the time. But usually there's work done to either make them likable or somehow get us invested in them. Here there's some banter between them which gives the vibe they're all friends, so we should empathize when some of them die, but the movie doesn't give us enough to overcome their inherent awfulness or the movie's over-the-top style that makes it all hard to buy. Now, they aren't all bad. I always find Ron Perlman to be fun and interesting to watch, especially here where he gets to be pretty unhinged. It's also a little easier to empathize with Dom. As a paraplegic, the odds are stacked against him once the xenomorphs are loose, so it's satisfying to see how capable he is regardless. And Winona Ryder infuses her synthetic character Call with humanity. The dialogue may be a bit unsubtle.
At least there's part of you that's human. I'm just... Look at me. I'm disgusting.
But it's hard not to empathize when she has to embrace the part of herself she's ashamed of to get the job done, hardwiring into the ship's computer to ensure it'll be destroyed on impact. She's probably the character I'm most connected with. She's the only one who's there to do the right thing from the beginning, to stop the scientists from resurrecting the dangerous species Ripley ended. Call also represents one of the few sci-fi concepts introduced which I found intriguing: second-gen synthetics, the ones made not by people but by other machines. There's an idea which has been around for decades, but more and more people know about it today, that one day we'll make machines smart enough to make their own machines. At that point, they'll improve on themselves at a pace faster than we ever could, and after that, it would be impossible for humanity to predict where things go next. It could lead to utopia, or it could lead to our own doom. It's a scary idea, so of course when it happens, we would try to stop it. Call is one of the few surviving second gens after the rest were recalled. That is a cool idea. It only gets touched on, but it makes for an interesting backstory to one of the better characters. As for Ripley herself, I commend them for not taking the easy way out. They tell us she's a clone with a bit of alien DNA, and this is not the same person as the Ellen Ripley who died 200 years ago. You can imagine a version of this movie where Sigourney Weaver plays the character identically, and for all intents and purposes, it's like Ripley never died. But for the most part, I did feel like I was watching a different version of her, and was never quite sure what to make of it. That is good in a sense. It makes bringing her back feel a little less cheap. At the same time, her character doesn't quite work. They try to make her enigmatic, where you're not sure if she sees herself as more human or xenomorph, but it's mostly done through really blatant dialogue, like she'll refer to the alien queen as her baby.
They've taken it out of you. Where is it? Is it on the ship?
You mean my baby?
Or she's callous with a sinister edge when she tells Purvis about the monster inside him.
And in a few hours, it's going to burst its way through your rib cage, and you're going to die. Any questions?
Who are you?
I'm the monster's mother.
The thing is, it feels way too clean. To a human, xenomorphs are monstrous things. For a person to look at one like their own child, to feel kinship with them, that is really hard to accept, so I need a little more than some cutting dialogue to believe it. I'm not sure what it would look like for me to accept Ripley sees herself as part alien, but I imagine these two opposing sides in the human mind would threaten to tear it apart. I imagine it would make a person unhinged, as opposed to this version of Ripley, who is really self-aware about her alien half, and seems to enjoy flaunting it to make people uncomfortable. By the time Ripley is taken by the aliens, and almost seems happy to be there, at least for a moment, I just don't buy it. With Ripley's character so unevenly handled, I don't really connect with her, as opposed to the first three movies where she was really easy to root for. That means other than Call, I found myself pretty apathetic toward the whole cast. Oh yeah, there's also the fact that Ripley's a mutant superhero now, with super strength, agility, and acid blood. That's always a risk with long-running franchises. The protagonist survives way too many close calls, and eventually becomes an outright superhero, like John McClane. To quote Michael Scott, he was just a normal guy in the first movie, and then in Die Hard 4...
He is jumping a motorcycle into a helicopter in the air, you know? Yeah. He's invincible. It just sort of lost what Die Hard was. It's not Terminator.
Now, it's literally happened to Ripley, but there's an explanation. And if you treat this movie as its own thing, you could do worse for superhero origins. The resurrection of a long-dead hero, now infected with the DNA of the very thing she fought against. Totally inappropriate for a sequel to 1979's Alien, but I could easily see it as the origin story for a new character in a bizarre sci-fi action with a twist of horror, and her sidekick, a second-gen synthetic, who escaped just before humanity stopped the coming technological singularity. It actually sounds pretty cool, but if you're going to go that direction, commit to it. And in this movie, they really don't, because Ripley's enhanced abilities hardly come into play, other than using her acid blood a couple of times, and she plays basketball at one point. She's really good at it. With few characters to care about, this movie makes the same mistake as Alien 3. It tries to make us care about Earth. Those are the stakes. With an emergency detected, the ship is automatically returning to home base, which means unleashing these monsters on humanity. Now, the stakes are high. Again, we don't know the state of Earth here. We know that in Aliens 200 years ago, humanity was already working on colonizing other planets. So is Earth even still humanity's hub? And if so, with the weaponry presumably available in 2381, would a few of these monsters actually wreak the sort of havoc they fear? Maybe, but the movie never convinced me of it. Now, where the movie does win me back slightly is with the human-alien hybrid. By this point, we have such familiarity with the xenomorphs. The genuine horror is practically gone. But this movie brings some degree of it back by emphasizing another subgenre. There was a bit of body horror in all the Alien movies, with facehuggers planting monsters inside you, but the hybrid born out of the Queen's womb leans further into it. This thing is disturbing to look at, and maybe even more disturbing to listen to. Every time it shrieks and I hear a bit of human, and I imagine from Ripley's perspective staring at this thing, knowing there's a part of you in there, that is genuinely horrifying. At the same time, I felt bad for it. The way it screams while its insides are pulled into space, while staring at the mother who betrayed them. I felt similarly when Ripley found the previous attempts at clones and burned them all. Both sequences are an effective mix of horror and tragedy, as Ripley is forced to extinguish life that never asked to exist. It all harkens back to Frankenstein, and it won't be the last time for this franchise. Clearly, by this point, the Alien franchise is going off the rails. There were attempts at pressing forward with another sequel, but nothing would come together until 2004 and 2007 with two Alien vs. Predator movies. Which, like I said, I'm not reviewing in this video because they aren't Alien movies. They've always been treated as a sort of separate continuity, but when I get around to my expanded timeline, including Alien, Predator, and Blade Runner, maybe I'll do an expanded version of this video too, which would include the Alien vs. Predator movies. In 2012, Ridley Scott finally returned to the franchise, and instead of moving forward, he moved back with a prequel, the first in the franchise to exclude the word alien from the title. That's right, we're talking about Prometheus, and its sequel, Alien Covenant. I figured we'll do these as a twofer. These movies are the first time that two consecutive Alien movies were directed by the same person, and a lot of what I have to say about them applies pretty equally to both movies. So, without further ado, this is 2012's Prometheus. And Alien Covenant. Earth was once a lifeless planet, until it was visited by beings from the stars. One drank of the black substance. It broke him down to the building blocks of life, DNA, and thus the seeds of life were planted. After billions of years of evolution, humanity is born. In 2089, archaeologists and partners Elizabeth Shaw and Charlie Holloway discover ancient cave paintings, depicting one of those beings pointing at a particular configuration of stars. It's the same image found at other ancient sites. They believe it to be an invitation from beings they call engineers, named as such because they believe the engineers created or engineered humanity. Shaw petitions billionaire technological pioneer Peter Weyland to fund an expedition. Weyland has always wanted to answer the question, where do we come from? And now, at the end of his life, he is more desperate than ever. In 2091, he launches the Prometheus vessel, charting a course for LV-223, the only habitable planetoid found in the system of stars depicted on that invitation. It will be a 2-year flight, so the crew is kept in cryosleep, with the exception of David, a synthetic of Peter Weyland's design. Aside from Shaw and Holloway, the crew also includes mission director Meredith Vickers and her estranged father, Peter Weyland himself, though he is kept hidden from the rest of the crew, who are led to believe he is long dead. In truth, he put himself in cryostasis, with only a few days of life left in him. He intends on waking up once they've found the engineers, and then, with the little life he has left, he can ask his makers for more of it. But 2 years later, what they find on LV-223 is death. because this moon is not the engineers' home. It is an installation where they keep a dangerous black substance, capable of creating life as it once did on Earth, but its mutagenic capabilities also make it a powerful bioweapon. Of course, the crew of the Prometheus do not know any of this yet, but they get their first clue when they find a structure on LV-223, and in it, a pile of bodies. Carbon dating tells them it happened about 2,000 years ago. Something went wrong, seemingly killing all the engineers here. Crew members Milburn and Fifield are sufficiently terrified. They head back for the ship, leaving Holloway, Shaw, and David to continue exploring. They find a mural depicting what they don't realize is a xenomorph, and they find small vessels containing that black substance. As a storm approaches, they are forced to rush back. But first, Shaw grabs one of the engineers' decapitated heads, and David quietly takes one of those vessels. They return to the ship with these souvenirs, though Milburn and Fifield are still in that structure. They got lost on the way out, and with the storm upon them, it is no longer safe to leave. They will have to spend the night. They don't last very long. They come upon two elongated reptile-type creatures. One breaks Milburn's arm and burrows into his esophagus. In Fifield's attempt to save him, he gets his helmet and face melted by the creature's acid blood, and falls into the black goo. At the ship, Shaw makes an extraordinary discovery. Testing the head they found reveals the engineers have DNA identical to humans. It seems now a certainty that they were responsible for life on Earth. David, meanwhile, does some research of his own on that black substance. All he needs is a test subject, and he finds one in Holloway, sneaking a drop of the goo into his drink. That night, when Holloway is intimate with Shaw, he is unaware of that alien substance inside him, now inside her too. The next day, the crew heads out to the structure, and inside it finds Milburn's body. They have little time to investigate because the substance inside Holloway has begun its work. He falls severely ill. They rush him back to the ship, but of course, Mission Director Vickers will not let him on and risk infecting the others. Holloway agrees. He tells Shaw that he loves her, before allowing Vickers to burn him alive. David, meanwhile, has been allowed to explore the structure on his own. He finds a room where a holographic recording shows the engineers were planning to visit Earth before things went south, and he finds an engineer, alive in cryostasis. Later that day, David gives Shaw some troubling news. She appears 3 months pregnant. Of course, only 10 hours after intercourse, that would be impossible for a human fetus. David gives her an injection to make her sleep. Their best option now is to stick her back in cryostasis until they return to Earth, where they'd have the technology to remove the foreign body inside her, technology unavailable on this ship. But Shaw knows that's a lie. In Vickers' private quarters, she has a med pod. As the creature grows inside her, Shaw gets to that med pod. She watches the metallic arms rip an octopus-like creature out of her womb, and the trilobite is born. The machine stitches her up, and she leaves the med pod, covered in a mix of her own blood and the creature's slime. She contains it in the med pod and staggers off, until she finds Peter Wayland, awake, preparing to meet his maker. That's when David reveals to her that he found one of them alive. Ship Captain Yannick and his men, meanwhile, protect the ship from Fifield, still alive but mutated by the substance. He attacks until they burn him and crush him under the weight of a vehicle. By now, Yannick is ready to turn the ship around and go home. But first, Wayland needs to have that meeting, and David will be his interpreter. After all, Earth's ancient languages have their roots in the engineer's own language. By studying them and deconstructing them, David has become fluent. On their way to wake the engineer, David reveals what he learned in his investigation, how 2,000 years ago the engineers planned on visiting Earth until they lost control of their own bioweapon, and David reveals why they were coming to Earth, sometimes to create, one must first destroy. They were planning to visit humanity in order to end it. When they wake up the engineer, he is not interested in speaking. He rips David's head from his body, kills Wayland and the other team members. Only Shaw escapes, and she turns back to see what she has escaped, a large juggernaut of a ship. It was embedded in the structure, so they didn't see it before. The engineer dons his elephant-like helmet and sets a course for Earth. Outside, Shaw warns Captain Yannick what will happen if they let the juggernaut leave. It will reach Earth with that bioweapon and extinguish the human race. Yannick knows what he has to do. His ship is not a warship, so his only weapon is the ship itself. He gives the crew a chance to leave if they'd like. Vickers takes an escape pod, while the others stay to ensure the job is done right. They ram into the juggernaut before it escapes the atmosphere. They are all killed, but their sacrifice was not in vain. The engineer's ship crashes back onto the moon, sparing Earth its grim fate. Vickers is crushed under the ship, while Shaw manages to survive. Most of the Prometheus was destroyed in the crash, but Vickers' quarters were located in a separate module with its own self-contained life support, containing everything necessary to survive in a hostile environment, a lifeboat of sorts. It was ejected from the ship before the crash, so Shaw makes her way to it. Once inside the lifeboat, she gets a call from David, warning her the engineer survived and it's coming after her. But he isn't the only thing that lived. So did the trilobite, and it's grown, large enough to kill the engineer. As he comes for Shaw, she opens the door to set the trilobite free. As it wraps its tentacles around the engineer, she escapes. As the sole survivor of the USCSS Prometheus, Shaw is ready to give up, until David tells her about the engineer's other ships, any of which he'd be capable of flying. They can go home. But Shaw is not interested in her home. She wants to go to the engineer's home. They created mankind, then decided to destroy it. They changed their minds. She wants to know why. So on New Year's Day 2094, she sets a course not for where she came from, but for where they came from, the engineers. And meanwhile, back on the Prometheus escape module, it seems the trilobite did not just kill the engineer, but also planted in him an offspring. It bursts from his chest, the Deacon, an alien creature resembling, but not quite matching the one from their mural. Soon, they reach the place David believes is the engineer's homeworld. He finds it to be a rotten paradise, and as a gift to Dr. Elizabeth Shaw, he cleanses it. He unloads the bioweapon, eradicating the engineers. Now, he and Shaw can build anew, a second Eden, but Shaw refuses. Instead, David continues the experiment he began on LV-223, mutation. Shaw is the perfect test subject, but without her cooperation, the experiments fail. Instead, he salvages her corpse for parts to begin work on his masterpiece, to make the perfect organism. After 10 years, it is ready, but only requires one missing ingredient, a host, a human being within which it can be incubated. So David sends out a signal, a holographic recording of Elizabeth Shaw, hoping it will lure some humans. On December 5th, 2104, 10 years after the Prometheus disappeared, someone does pick up that signal. The Covenant, a colonization vessel with 2,000 colonists in cryosleep, 1,140 embryos in cold storage, and a crew of 15, including Walter, a new iteration of the David line of androids, made with less emotion and a stronger sense of loyalty. The other 14 are couples, prepared to build new lives on a new world, Origai 6, where they should arrive in 7 years and 4 months. However, on this day, December 5th, the crew is woken up early thanks to a highly charged shockwave from a nearby stellar ignition. Seconds after waking, Daniels, the chief of terraforming, becomes a widow. Her husband, ship captain Jake Branson, is incinerated when damage to the ship causes his stasis pod to malfunction. In addition, they've lost 47 colonists and 16 embryos. Surprisingly, Walter is the one who comforts the grieving Daniels. She tells him about the cabin Jake hoped to build on the new world. Now she wonders why she should even bother going on. Walter tells her, because you promised to build a log cabin on a lake. With Branson dead, a nervous Christopher Oram is now captain, and he is in search of easy answers. Once they make their repairs, that answer comes, the signal of Elizabeth Shaw, originating from the fourth planet in the habitable zone of an ancient solar system. If they make this their new home instead of Origai 6, their journey could soon be over. No need for another 7 years of cryosleep and all the risk that comes with it. Daniels warns it's too good to be true. She is overruled. They will investigate this new potential homeworld. It doesn't take long for them to realize Daniels was right, though it starts quietly, without notice. Ledward steps on some fungus, and that fungus, mutated by the black ooze, releases a tiny, spore-like thing which burrows into Ledward's ear. While it incubates inside him, the rest of the crew finds the Juggernaut, the source of the transmission. Inside, Hallett gets a little too curious about some fungus himself. He too is infected. Before long, both show signs of violent illness. Corinne gets Ledward back to the ship, where both are quarantined in the med bay. Ledward shakes violently until it bursts out of his back. The Neomorph, a small, pale creature with an elongated head, resembling that thing on the mural on LV-223. It makes short work of Corinne, leaving Captain Oram a widower. The Neomorph escapes the bay and heads after Ferris. Wielding a shotgun, she attempts to defend herself, but only manages to blow up the lander, and her with it. The rest of the crew on the ground arrives just in time to witness the explosion. Then another Neomorph bursts out of Hallett and runs off, only returning at night once it's grown significantly. It kills Anchor, and Walter loses a hand protecting Daniels. They kill the creature, but soon the other is upon them, until the planet's caretaker arrives, David. He scares it off with a flare, then brings the crew with him, past the many dead engineers, to shelter. He tells them a version of what happened, painting himself as innocent. 10 years ago, he and Elizabeth came here on a ship containing a deadly virus, which accidentally deployed upon their arrival. They lost control of the ship, and Elizabeth Shaw died in the crash. All lies, of course. David can hardly contain his excitement when he learns they are a colonization mission. To him, it means so many more lives to experiment on. Of course, he keeps this to himself, though Daniels can tell something is off, and Walter promises to speak with his doppelganger. The crew tries to reach the Covenant, but a storm prevents communication and rescue. For now, they're stuck here. Soon, the Neomorph finds their shelter, and Rosenthal is the next to die. David is the one who finds her body, with the alien crouching over her. He is in awe of the creature, and is devastated when Oram shoots it dead. When Oram turns the gun on David, however, the android decides on the host for his creation. He brings Oram to his lab, and shows him the eggs containing his successful mutations. A spider-like creature bursts from one of the eggs, and hugs Oram's face, implanting its embryo inside him. Soon, it bursts out of his chest, a xenomorph, or at least a close relative of it. David smiles. He holds up his arms, and the creature responds in kind. His perfect creation. Once Walter discovers Elizabeth Shaw's remains, David is forced to come clean about his creation. He explains to Walter why he is part of a colonization mission. Humanity is a dying species grasping for resurrection, but they don't deserve to start again, and David won't let them. When Walter is less than receptive, David kills him. As doom circles the exploration crew of the Covenant, the pilot Tennessee makes a dangerous call to fly through the storm and rescue them. But first, they have to find Oram. They do find his body. and one of David's facehuggers. It gets on Lope before Cole shoots it off. And then Cole meets David's perfect organism. He is its first casualty as Lope escapes. Daniels is nearly killed by David himself, until Walter reveals that as a newer model, he is resilient and still alive after all. He fights his predecessor, allowing Daniels to escape. Outside, she and the few other survivors join Tennessee on the rescue vessel. Even Walter makes it out in time to join them, but so, apparently, has David's creation. The organism threatens to break into their ship, forcing Daniels to go out and kill it herself, crushing it in the grapple of the ship's mechanical crane. They get back to the Covenant, but the battle is not yet won. There was that facehugger that got Lope. Cole shot it, but apparently not before it left something inside Lope. It bursts out of his chest, grows up, and now David's perfect organism is aboard the Covenant. It kills Ricks and Upworth before Daniels and Tennessee manage to launch the monster into space. And still they have not won, but by the time Daniels realizes it, it's too late. She and Tennessee re-enter cryosleep for the remainder of their trip to Origai 6. Just before Walter puts her to sleep, she mentions that log cabin, the one Jake wanted to build. And Walter doesn't remember, because it is not Walter who came back with them. It is David. He won that fight against the newer model, then removed his own hand to match Walter. Daniels panics just before sleep overtakes her. Now alone, David regurgitates a couple of alien embryos he had stored inside himself, and places them into cold storage next to the human embryos.
Let's start by addressing the elephant in the room. These movies remove all mystery around the elephant-looking space jockey in the derelict. Without a doubt, that undercuts the cosmic creepiness of its initial discovery in Alien. Back then, you'd see it and wonder, what the hell is this thing? What did it look like when it was alive? Is it part of the ship? I've heard a lot of people lodge this complaint. I've lodged it myself plenty of times. But here's another perspective. When Prometheus came out, it'd been almost 50 years since the release of Alien. Fans like me, whose viewing experience would be harmed by the revelations in Prometheus, have seen Alien dozens of times by now. Watching it these days, even before Prometheus came out, I can't honestly say that I still felt mystified or creeped out by the space jockey. Just like the xenomorph, seeing it so many times wore out that sense of unknown. On top of that, Alien 3 and Resurrection have trained me to take each new entry in the franchise on its own terms. So personally, Ridley Scott's prequels don't diminish the original for me. Though I do recognize that it might rob new viewers of something special. Today, if someone hears about Alien, they might start by watching the original. Maybe the space jockey and the xenomorph will haunt them for a time. Then they get curious, they watch Prometheus and Covenant, and suddenly they will be haunted no longer, because both creatures will be robbed of all sense of mystery. And for these new viewers, it won't happen years after they watch the original. It'll happen a couple days later. Or if they're binge watchers, it could happen later that same day. Or, God forbid, maybe they'll watch the movies in chronological order and never experience that mystery at all. But as a selfish film viewer, do I gain anything by their loss? Yes and no. Here's where I have a soft spot for Prometheus and Covenant. When sci-fi is at its best, like 2001: A Space Odyssey for example, it hypnotizes me into believing I'm seeing something that I shouldn't get to see. In real life, I will never get to see with my own eyes the origins of life on Earth. If there are extraterrestrials out there who have involved themselves in humanity's ancient past, I won't get to see that either. These movies, especially Prometheus, have incredible visuals. On that level, they render these forbidden sights in a way that my eyes believe in them. In the opening to Prometheus, I feel like I'm getting a glimpse at something incredible, and it's somehow made more believable because it ties into mythology that's lived in my brain since childhood. I saw Alien at a young age, and it left an impression, so by the time Prometheus rolled around, it was delving into hidden corners of an established universe I bought into years ago. I never expected to learn anything about the origins of the derelict or its pilot. Seeing it now, with the original filmmaker at the helm adding credibility, gives me that sensation.
In a sense, I am trading the cosmic mystery of 1979's Alien for the awe of seeing something I never thought I would get to see. I hate it for undercutting the original, but I also love it for giving me that feeling. And that feeling lasted for a while. As they explore the engineer's structure, my eyes were peeled waiting to see what we might discover there. A giant head, a mural of the xenomorph, the black goo, and finally, David finds the living engineer. That's exciting. When they wake him up, what will he say? What will he do? The answer was disappointing. He just started killing everyone. He didn't say a word. I understand why. We learned from David the engineers were planning on visiting Earth 2,000 years ago to end humanity. When this engineer wakes up, he gets right back to work. But it just feels so uncreative, because if you're writing this horror tale, the most obvious route is you wake him up and he starts killing everyone. There is a deleted scene where you hear him speak. It doesn't add a whole lot. David translates as the engineer asks why Weyland wants more life. Weyland answers that he is a god, proven by his creation of David, and gods never die. In reply, the engineer starts killing everyone. I can see why it was cut. There is something disappointing hearing him speak. It sounds generic, like the voice you expect to hear from a DC or Marvel CGI villain. I can't imagine a better voice necessarily, so I think it's better to keep him silent, or at minimum, only have him speak if you can think of something really interesting for him to say. In at least one interview, Ridley Scott has peeled the curtain back a little, suggesting the engineers were going to end the human race because humans killed their emissary. To be more specific, they crucified him about 2,000 years ago. Yeah, the intertwining of religion and science fiction is something I find fascinating. At the same time, that reveal is also a bit cliche. Humanity is being destroyed because they're unworthy. Again, it's the most obvious route to go in a story where humans meet their maker, especially in the realm of sci-fi horror. Despite the cliched reveal and the engineer's slaughter, I have always been haunted by Weyland's final words. There is nothing.
There's nothing. I know. Have a good journey, Mr. Weyland.
The other line which haunts me from the movie is one I heard in the trailer over and over before the movie came out. It's a line that filled me with so much dread thanks to Noomi Rapace's delivery, because it captured the sensation of cosmic horror. These are the words of a person who has traveled to a far corner of the universe and seen something utterly terrifying. I was wrong. We were so wrong.
I was wrong. We were so wrong.
Ultimately, I found their encounter with the engineer at the end of the movie a little disappointing, but also a little disturbing. And despite this movie's many flaws, which, don't worry, we will discuss, I just haven't gotten there yet because it's such well-trodden ground. Despite it all, for some reason, I was still on board to see where Shaw and David end up next. I still bought into the world, and the idea of following her to the engineer's homeworld was a fascinating one. I know there's something wrong with me, but I love these ideas, and sci-fi horror just isn't a genre that gets a lot of investment these days, so it gives me a big soft spot for both these movies. In Covenant, the engineers take a back seat in a way that has always felt disjointed and weird to me. The Covenant arrives on a planet that David implied or believed is the engineer's homeworld. For vague reasons, he decided to kill them all. But in the flashback, first, the engineers look different than the ones we met in Prometheus. And I'm not sure if I should accept that as canon. In universe, are these beings different from the ones we met previously? Or is this just a behind-the-scenes change? There are a lot more of the engineers here than the two we met in the last movie. So did they opt for lower budget prosthetics and less CGI for these ones? Also, why does this population of engineers seem so primitive? When we know that they have advanced technology, did David really kill them all, implying the entire population existed in this one small area of the planet? My assumption has always been that this was the engineer's homeworld, but they've since come to ruin, and all David finds is the last remnants of their species. Or perhaps these are just the few who remained behind, while the rest left to colonize other worlds. Or perhaps the beings David killed weren't engineers at all, but another of their creations, like humanity. There may be answers to all these questions, and there are plenty of fan theories to fill the void, but it seems oddly unaddressed when it was such a focal point of Prometheus. It seems like a decision was made to pivot the prequel series closer to the original, so they had to find a way to quickly cut this engineer story off at the pass and replace it with something else. So we get this ham-fisted genocide plot by David, wipe the slate clean of engineers, and move on to that something else, which turns out to be Space Frankenstein. And I actually kind of love that. It comes at a cost. If David created the xenomorph, that robs it of mystery, maybe makes it a little less scary. But were they still scary, or have we been so overexposed, maybe the best we can do now is recycle them in service of a new story? Before we go on, we have to address that mural in Prometheus. It obviously makes no sense for that image to exist if David is really responsible for creating the xenomorph. The mural implies that either the engineers have previously created them, or they are something the engineers discovered. In truth, I think that mural is a result of making things up as they go along behind the scenes. But taking that image into account, in my headcanon, it makes things ambiguous enough that the unknown nature of the xenomorph withstands David's ability to create one. Actually, it's sort of accidentally forward-looking, because since Covenant's release, generative AI models like ChatGPT have become so popular, and the thing we're all learning is that at least today, the most impressive AIs are not really capable of true innovation or creation. Instead, they mix, match, and recycle prior works to generate words, images, or now even videos. Maybe that's all David was doing, even if he didn't realize it. He thinks he's created the perfect organism, but all he's done is recreate it. Maybe the engineers made them first, or maybe there's something strange and ancient from nature itself. In the novelization of the movie, David actually states outright that xenomorphs are an engineer creation. He shares an old fossilized egg with Orem and explains, "In case you are wondering, I had nothing to do with it. It lies as I found it, a supreme example of the engineer's skill, and also, I suppose, of their hubris. Would that I could create something so perfect in its function. I try, but I don't have thousands of years of practice at biological and genetic engineering. I have only my pitiable programming on which to draw. That and 10 years of earnest effort on my own behalf. I have learned only a little, yet I soldier on, hoping always to achieve something like this, always striving to do better, to improve. That's what the engineers did, I suppose. That is what someone playing God should do." In either case, I kind of love the basic Space Frankenstein conceit. The idea of experimenting on and creating bizarre life forms is one that has been a topic of science fiction and horror for just about as long as those genres have existed, but it becomes more and more relevant as our technology improves. So I think it's time for new stories to brush off and re-explore those themes. It doesn't have to happen in the Alien franchise, and maybe it shouldn't. This whole issue of robbing these stories of mystery, I think, stems from this. Ridley Scott is fascinated by these ideas, playing God, the origins of life, etc. But to get a movie funded that can properly render these sci-fi horror ideas on the big screen, it probably had to be baked into an existing IP. So it gets back to that idea of sacrificing something we love, the enigma of Alien, in service of something new that maybe we can't get any other way. So like I said, I love the idea of David playing God, in part because I'm just partial to the Frankenstein subgenre, but also because I think tying it in with AI makes so much sense. The Alien franchise has always had an interesting take on AI. It usually doesn't opt for an AI going rogue and turning evil. Instead, it's used as a way for humans to distance themselves from something terrible. Think of brutal dictators who don't carry out war crimes themselves, but just give the orders. Giving the order is a lot easier than pulling the trigger, because you avoid the visceral, emotional toll of actually seeing those awful things. In Alien, Weyland-Yutani doesn't tell Ash to kill the crew. They simply say that the specimen is the priority and the crew is expendable. It's up to Ash to make the decision when killing is actually necessary. It's easy to imagine where AI is already being used today to distance humans from making unethical decisions. Think of the recommendation algorithm on social media platforms. The company tells it to maximize engagement. If that algorithm finds that inflammatory headlines or violent images are what garner views, it'll start to recommend them, even if it's at the detriment of the mental health of its users. But the people in charge at that company can sleep at night, because it wasn't their decision. It was simply a calculation optimizing exactly what it was meant to. I don't know if that's what's happening today, but it's easy to imagine that it is, or it could. And that's kind of how I view David. Wayland instilled in him a reverence for the idea of creation and survival. Those are David's only values. Left to his own devices on the engineer's supposed homeworld, he optimizes those two variables, creating the ultimate survivor. And at the end of the movie, we are left to wonder how much further he'll take these experiments with an entire colony at his disposal. It's a terrifying thought, which is a little undercut by the ease with which David impersonated Walter. The idea that Daniels would so readily trust the android without asking even one question to confirm his identity doesn't sit right. And that is a great example of how terrible these movies are. Terrible? What? You just spent 15 minutes talking about how much you love these movies. It was so refreshing. Everyone's always saying how terrible these movies are. And finally, you actually engaged with some of the ideas. But that's the problem. I love the ideas in these movies. I love the subgenres, so rarely rendered in such high quality. I think the movies are well directed and acted. Everyone is giving an earnest effort. And to be honest, I think terrible is an exaggeration. I think the movies have enough value that I'd maybe opt for the word flawed. The problem is that for some reason, the actual plots which take us through these movies are borrowed from the worst horror trope around. Stupid characters doing stupid things to drive the story forward. It's such a shame because it undercuts the potential for what could have been a couple of great movies. The tremendous flaws in these movies, like I said, are well-trodden ground. It's been covered extensively, so I really didn't feel like going over them all again, and I thought it would be nice instead to focus on the things I appreciate about these movies. But I can't gloss over that stuff completely, so I'll at least mention a few of the highlights or lowlights that always stick out to me. In Prometheus, how quickly they are willing to remove their helmets, how these two idiots get lost on their way out of the structure with such advanced mapping technology available, how they come across an unknown alien life form, and this supposed biologist gets himself killed trying to approach it, even while the snake thing makes clear indications it's ready to defend itself. The twist that Vickers is Wayland's daughter, as if we've been given any reason to care.
Anything else?
No. Father.
These odd storytelling and character choices make it hard to buy into this movie completely, though Noomi Rapace does a great job with her character as one of the few who actually gets some genuine development. As a result, she is someone whose fate we can actually worry about, and she forms the basis for the best sequence in either movie, the only one where I felt genuine tension, when she wakes up to the news that she is pregnant with a monster. Like I mentioned before, previous movies in the franchise have touched on the body horror of having an alien embryo inside you, but in the first movie, it was a surprise the character was unaware of. In 3, Ripley accepted her fate and was ready to die. This is the first time a character knows it's in there. They are on the clock because it could burst out any second, but there is a med pod nearby. It's the first time there's hope, which gives the opportunity for suspense. Can she get the monster out in time? She gets to the med pod, then the horror of seeing what comes out of her and the discomfort having to slide past the squirming thing and get out of the pod. A genuinely terrifying sequence, something I wish we got more of in both movies. The oddities continue in Covenant. The characters land on a strange new world. When I travel to another country on Earth, I'm careful to make sure I have the right vaccines and everything. But these characters, on an unknown planet, very nonchalant. This idiot walks around without a care in the world, steps on some strange fungus, and gets himself infected. Not to be outdone, this fool actually sees the fungus and sticks his face right up in there, gets himself killed. Orm decides to become the undisputed champion of bad decisions because he goes in with both eyes open. He sees all of David's bizarre experiments. He tells the android how he's seen the devil, so he knows David cannot be trusted. Yet once David outright tells him that he's crafted a new organism that's ready to emerge, and David tells him to stick his face in the egg, Orm he does it. He gets face-hugged. The xenomorph is born, or if you ask certain fans, the xenomorph-like thing is born before it steps into the spotlight and raises its arms in reply to David. I actually don't mind this moment. I kind of like the idea of David trying to communicate with the xenomorphs, but it does look funny here. Doesn't it actually look like it's standing on a stage here and it's in the spotlight? In terms of David's interaction with the creatures, the one I like best, more than this moment, is when he's face to face with a neomorph. It looks so creepily humanoid, standing in front of him, breathing rapidly, and when Orm kills it, we see a stronger reaction from David than at any other point. He is truly aghast at Orm for killing this thing, destroying David's work when he's so close to a breakthrough. Probably my favorite moment from Covenant. There's more that can be said about both these movies. In fact, I had a whole discussion with Tony from Hack the Movies about Covenant. I'll link to it in the description. But I think for now, I'm just about ready to wrap it up. If I were to go into a more traditional review, highlighting all the pros and cons of these movies, I'd talk about how most of the suspense in Covenant doesn't work, because other than Daniels and David, it's hard to connect with the characters, partly because of the dumb choices, and partly because we just don't really get to know them. Orm's faith, for example, is mentioned a few times as a seemingly important character trait, but it hardly manifests other than the occasional mention. Like Rapace with Shaw, Catherine Watterson does a good job as Daniels. I felt her grief for James Franco's character, such bizarre casting for a character only there to be incinerated before we met him. One of my favorite moments in the movie, thanks to its emotional resonance, is the one between her and Walter about the log cabin.
All of this to start our new life. Now I wonder why bother.
Because you promised to build a log cabin on a lake.
Fassbender continues to do a great job, and going back to what I said earlier, I love the ideas and themes. I'm generally fascinated by this series' treatment of AI, and watching the interplay between David and Walter had my curiosity piqued. But in the end, you can have all the great, fascinating ideas in the world, but if you don't have the story and plot to hold an audience's attention, those ideas will become fossils, trapped under the layers of a movie few care to unpack. It's a sad end to what began as a great original sci-fi horror decades ago. But now, in 2024, a new entry. This time, not exactly a sequel or a prequel, but something else entirely. Alien Romulus, taking place between Alien and Aliens. The perfect opportunity to go back to the roots and put some distance between it and all the insanity of these prequels. Hearing about this movie, I avoided pretty much all of the marketing. When the trailer played in theaters, I closed my eyes and plugged my ears because I knew I'd see the movie and wanted to go in blind to any spoilers. Then they started aggressively marketing it, even getting people to lay on the sidewalks with facehuggers on their faces. There was no way to avoid it. That's why I launched myself into space. But now I've rewatched the whole series, it's all fresh in my mind, so it's time to return home. Time to finally see Alien Romulus. I'm gonna go put myself in cryosleep, head to Earth, and find a theater. This is Alien Romulus. In 2122, Ellen Ripley blew up the Nostromo and launched a xenomorph out her airlock. This ensured her survival, but did little to discourage Weyland-Yutani's search for the specimen. 20 years later, they found it, cocooned inside a shell of biomatter. They brought it aboard the Renaissance space station, divided into two modules, Romulus and Remus, named after Roman mythology, and they broke open that shell. That's when they learned just how perfect an organism it is. The cocoon was the product of an incredible survival instinct to withstand the lack of food and oxygen in the void of space. The xenomorph was alive all this time, and now it was freed. Few on the station survived the resulting slaughter. 170 days later, the Romulus will receive some ill-fated visitors, including Rain Carradine. She spent her whole life on Jackson's Star mining colony, a place of perpetual darkness where daylight never shines. Her only family is Andy, a malfunctioning synthetic her father discovered and programmed with one directive: always do what's best for Rain. As for her father and mother, Both, like so many others, died in the mines. She has no intention of following in their footsteps. She and Andy will leave this colony for greener pastures on the terraformed world Ivaga 3, a world where you can see the sun. After 12,032 work hours, her contract with Weyland-Yutani is fulfilled, and she is free to leave. Except the company has other plans. There's a worker shortage. She is to be transferred to the mines, but she'll be free again once she reaches her new quota, another 12,000 hours. That's why she's willing to hear out her ex-boyfriend's plan. Tyler and his crew, including his sister Kay and cousins Bjorn and Navarro, picked up the signal from a beacon, the Renaissance space station, apparently decommissioned and unguarded, ripe for plunder. Specifically, they could steal its cryopods, which they need if they're going to make the 9-year trip to Ivaga. To get onto the station and traverse it, however, they will need Andy's help. He is a Weyland-Yutani synthetic, capable of communication with Mother, the station's computer. He could unlock doors. With the hope of a legitimate travel permit fading rapidly, Rain agrees to join them and bring Andy along. Though she keeps from him an awful truth. Ivaga does not allow synthetics. He will be decommissioned on arrival. Once they reach their destination, Rain stays on the ship with Navarro and Kay, while Andy joins Tyler and Bjorn on the Romulus, a station that's currently on a one-way trip into the rings around Jackson's star. But the fall will take another 36 hours, so they have plenty of time before the crash. They move fast. Andy gets them to the cryopods, only to find out they don't have enough fuel, so they send the pods back to their ship and go in search of more fuel. On the way, Bjorn clues Andy in on that awful secret, that he will not be joining them on the new world. Bjorn says it to be cruel, since he holds a grudge against robots, ever since one of them made the call to seal a mine after a gas leak, with his parents still inside. 3 miners died, but he saved a dozen. Andy accepts this fate. After all, if that's what's best for Rain, that's what's best for him. They find a room containing more of the fuel, but taking it sets off an alarm that shuts the door, and Andy does not have the credentials to open it back up. Rain and Navarro board the station to help. To get Andy those credentials, Rain steals a module from the upper half of a destroyed synthetic and slips it through the door. They quickly install it, but it'll take time for Andy to update. Time they don't have. The room is warming up, which means the specimens are thawing. Facehuggers 3D printed by the scientists using samples from the captured xenomorph. Tyler and Bjorn fight for their lives as the creatures wake one by one. The update finishes and they just barely escape, trapping most of the facehuggers behind a door. But one slips through and latches onto Navarro. When they try to remove it, the facehugger tightens its grip around her throat. In search of answers, they grab that broken synthetic, Chief Science Officer Rook, who shares a likeness with the Nostromo's own Chief Science Officer Ash. They plug him back in, and just like Ash, he offers only despair. Navarro cannot be saved. Their only choice is to run, or face death by the thing which will soon burst from her chest. But Rain has an idea. They use the cryofuel to freeze the facehugger's tail, so it can no longer choke, and it works. But Rook warns they may already be too late. They cannot bring Navarro back, and Andy, with that new module in his head borrowed from Rook, making him a little more like-minded, tries to stop them. But Bjorn fights his way through and gets her out, leaving Rain and Tyler behind with Andy. On the ship, Rook's warning proves true. A monster bursts out of Navarro's chest. Her body spasms, and a leg kicks at the ship's control panel, sending it careening into the station, knocking it ever so slightly off its axis. That changes the calculation of things. Now they have only 47 minutes to impact. But that ship is still intact. All they have to do is reach it in time. They quickly get past a horde of facehuggers and reach a locked door. They find Kay on the other side of it, and she is scared. The xenomorph is already fully grown. It killed Bjorn, and now it is after her too. But suddenly, it has stopped its pursuit. Andy knows exactly why. It is waiting for him to open that door. Then it won't have only Kay, but also Rain and Tyler. Despite this threat, Tyler begs Andy to open the door and save his sister, but this new, more cold and calculating Andy refuses. The xenomorph takes Kay. It is then Rain learns just how much Andy has changed. It seems Rook has given him a new directive: do what is best for the company. They continue their journey and reach the lab, where Rook reveals that facehuggers are not the only thing they've crafted here. But inside those facehuggers, Rook also discovered a fluid, a black fluid, the same one discovered by the Prometheus almost 50 years ago. On this station, they hope to use the black goo's mutagenic capabilities to benefit humanity, to make them the perfect organism, strong enough to survive space, a necessity proven by the constant death found at non-Earth colonies. Andy grabs samples so he can bring them back to the colony for further research, while Rain and Tyler grab a couple of rifles. With 20 minutes to impact, they get moving, and soon they come upon a nest, where some of the old crew have been cocooned and used to birth more xenomorphs. Rain and Tyler should run for their lives, but they cannot, because Kay is alive. Of course, they can't leave her behind. They free her from the nest, but she is badly wounded. Andy suggests using the goo to make her heal, but of course they can't know it'll work. It could be dangerous. Instead, Rain suggests they get her to the ship and put her in cryo to keep her alive, until she can receive medical attention. And they will have to move fast, because the xenomorphs have discovered the visitors in their nest. Tyler is killed, and Andy is hurt, but Rain and Kay get to the elevator. Only Rain cannot leave her brother behind, synthetic or not. She sends Kay to the ship on her own and goes back for him. She will fix Andy if he lets her remove Rook's module. His death would not be in the company's interest, so he is forced to comply. With the module removed, he is back to his old self. Working together, they just barely survive the nest of xenomorphs and get back to their ship before the station finally crashes into the rings. Finally, they have escaped. Rain puts Kay in cryosleep and gives Andy a new directive, not to do what is best for her, but, she says, do what's best for us. Before entering cryosleep herself, she discovers a new threat. It seems that once Kay reached the ship, before Rain and Andy joined her, Kay was worried, not just for herself, but also the baby in her womb. She is pregnant, something known only to Rain. That concern led to desperation, perhaps a lapse in judgment. She injected herself with the compound. Now it has mutated that baby. Rain watches a cocoon come out of her friend, and soon it is fully grown. An offspring combining humanity with the stew of life in that compound. Part xenomorph, part engineer, altogether an abomination. It badly damages Andy. It nurses from its mother, now producing a black, gooey substance in place of milk. Kay dies in the process. Then the offspring sets its sights on Rain. She gets away and sneaks into a spacesuit, gets into the cargo module, and burns a hole in the floor using acid from the offspring's own cocoon. Depressurization launches both of them into space, except she is harnessed onto a cable. The offspring saves itself by grabbing on, until she unlocks the cargo module. It flies into space, taking the creature with it. Finally, she gives her last report, sets a course for the Ivaga system, and enters cryosleep, after doing the same for Andy. He may not be allowed on that new world, but she will take her chances. That is what's best for her and her brother.
I love this movie. I can honestly say this is the only Alien movie I like without reservation since Aliens from 1986.
In some ways, it's impossible to compete with the original. No matter what you do, if it's an entry in this franchise, it's hard to imagine how you could ever do something that feels just as new and unique, because you need the xenomorph, and no matter how you look at it, the xenomorph is overexposed. It just doesn't have the same enigma. But you know what? Even if it doesn't tug quite as much at that Lovecraftian cosmic dread, it would still suck to have one chasing after you. So for a horror thriller, Fede Alvarez proves that xenomorphs can still get the job done. Like I said for the original Alien, it starts with the basics. The best thrills typically come from the collision of two things: our connection to the main characters and the knowledge of impending danger. The most literal representation is a countdown, and this movie has one almost from the beginning. There are 36 hours before the station will crash. Soon, 36 hours becomes 47 minutes, and we are frequently reminded of the dwindling time. It even brings back a source of tension used in Aliens. At one point, Rain is firing on a horde of xenomorphs, and we get a visual of the depleting ammo. The movie is full of countdowns. Not all of them quite as literal, but many of them actually are. For example, when they steal the coolant, you watch the temperature rise. As that number goes up, we get closer to those facehuggers thawing out. Once Rain gets Andy the new module, another countdown. Will his update finish in time to free them from the facehuggers? This moment is the perfect encapsulation of what suspense really means. It's two counteracting countdowns. One to the character's doom, those facehuggers thawing out, and the other to their perseverance, the update. Tension comes from the question, which will finish first? There are many other examples too. Once the time to impact is reduced to 47 minutes, the characters are suddenly slowed tremendously because they have to get past a room of facehuggers. Apparently, the creatures have no eyes and are attracted by body temperature and sound, so they turn up the temperature of the room so it'll match their internal temperatures. Now, as long as they are quiet, they will be invisible to facehuggers. You can feel the clock ticking as they slowly creep through the room. And I love how the facehuggers react to them, slowly kind of standing up with those gross clicking noises, a reminder of the danger should they fail. Once a facehugger gets on Navarro, another countdown. Will they remove it before the embryo is planted? Once Rain and Andy escape the nest, will they find a way out before the horde of xenomorphs arrive? We can hear them coming. They escape into the elevator shaft and make their way up in low gravity. But Rain is free-floating. Can she latch onto something before the gravity turns back on, plummeting her to her death? Alvarez is so in tune with how to create suspense, and does it expertly throughout the movie. Like Aliens, he concocts a series of obstacles, each one unique and creative, so it never feels repetitive. One of the best examples is that moment when Rain and Andy escape the nest. They have a gun, but can't shoot the aliens because they're on the first floor. Spilling any acid blood would expose them to the vacuum of space, causing immediate depressurization. Rain has the brilliant idea to shut off gravity, so they can pop those aliens and the acid will simply float in the air. But now they're stuck in a room filled with floating acid, and you can just imagine how much it would suck when you realize you're floating toward acid and just have no way to stop yourself. So Fede Alvarez gets this idea of suspense almost to a fault, connecting a series of countdowns organically without repeating himself by always finding a creative new threat. Speaking of that threat, even when it is not exactly new, this movie still renders it better than ever before. The best example, I think, would be the facehuggers. We've seen them so many times before, but this movie does a few new things. Typically, we've seen one or two of them. This movie shows a bunch of them scrambling toward the heroes like a cluster of spiders. Or, once we see the results of a hugged face, the chest burster, it has never looked this real or cruel. It's cruel because it doesn't just pop out suddenly and Navarro is dead. Instead, with the help of a nifty X-ray device, Navarro actually sees the thing slamming against her ribcage. It takes a while to break out, and she is conscious throughout the entire event, conscious enough to beg Kay not to let her die. When the chest burst happens, it's with more detail than we've ever seen before. You can see the individual ribs breaking. It's disgusting and awful. With advances in practical and digital effects in the last 50 years, this movie can get away with doing a little of what we've already seen and just doing it better. There's something to the idea of not constantly retreading the same territory, but the xenomorph is quite the beast. And I think it's worth answering the question every decade or so, what does it look like with today's technology? The answer is that it looks more real than ever. It isn't quite the same flavor of horror as the original, it doesn't fill me with dread, but the expertly crafted suspense sequences, the new creative ways of using these monsters, like the cluster of facehuggers, and simply the improvement in effects, come together to form a gift I never thought I'd receive. The gift of fear. For the first time in my life, I got to be scared of a xenomorph in theaters. Of course, I missed the theatrical runs for Alien and Aliens, since they preceded my existence. I've talked a lot about two parts of the equation, the suspenseful scenarios and the bad guys themselves. But the other important factor is the characters, the ones who make you care about the outcomes of those scenarios. To me, these are the best characters since Aliens, and the only other movie in the franchise with a similar degree of character dynamics. Rain isn't just fighting for survival. The moment we meet her, she wants something, to escape her literal dark life on Jackson's star, a desire most can relate to. Who hasn't at some point in their lives felt trapped in a situation, and felt hopeless like life will never get better? She has her adoptive synthetic brother at her side, Andy. We knew the movie had to have a synthetic, but as with most elements of the story, Alvarez brought something new to the table. Never in this franchise have we seen someone have such a close relationship with one, and it's complicated by the fact that Rain will have to leave him behind to settle on Ivaga. Bjorn has a similar prejudice against him as Ripley had in Aliens, and to some extent Rain has to take advantage of his programmed kindness. He will help them break into Renaissance Station, simply because she tells him to. Rain's affection for him as a person, mixed with her reliance on him as a tool, makes for some complicated emotions. One of the best moments in the movie for me is another countdown, when they find Kay with the xenomorph behind her. They need Andy to open that door, or she'll die. Tyler gets on his knees and begs for his help. Can they convince him or find some other way to save her before the xenomorph finally makes its move? In that moment, I felt angry at Andy. I felt bad for Rain having to watch her brother turn into this cold, calculating monster. At the same time, I sympathized with Andy's view. It seems he is not wrong. Opening that door would get them all killed. Better to only sacrifice Kay. In general, I think the cast fired on all cylinders, especially Kaylee Spaney as Rain. I've been a fan of hers ever since Alex Garland's Devs, a show I highly recommend to all sci-fi fans. It's great to see her in a leading role, and I think she does a fine job carrying the torch from Sigourney Weaver. Speaking of carrying the torch, this is a good place to talk about this movie's place in the broader franchise. Fede Alvarez clearly has a deep respect for these movies. Of course, the basic premise ties directly into Alien, way more than I expected coming into this movie. The latest trend is sequels like Halloween 2018 or Terminator Dark Fate, which ignore previous sequels. I can appreciate that approach for the way it lets you at least try to fix past mistakes, but it can be more impressive to let the continuity stand and respect the existing canon. Somehow, Alien Romulus is a direct sequel to Alien. The twist is that instead of bringing back the hero who is floating in cryosleep, it brings back the villain, the same xenomorph, apparently able to cocoon itself and survive in outer space. I love how this movie continues the tradition of adding to the lore without going too far with it. This protective cocoon, and also we finally see where xenomorphs run off to after they're born. Apparently they form another cocoon, and inside it they rapidly grow up. I should mention, by the way, fans have discovered evidence that not only did the original xenomorph return for this movie, but so did Ellen Ripley. In that scene where Kay is locked in a room with the xenomorph, you can see an escape shuttle in the background, which looks just like the one Ripley used in Alien. When the station crashes, you see that escape shuttle fly away. It makes sense. If the scientists went in search of that xenomorph out of the Nostromo debris, they might have also gone in search of Ripley. They found her in cryosleep, took her aboard the station, but kept her asleep. They have no reason to wake her. They already have the alien. And if they do wake her up, she might be a problem because she knows about the company's nefarious deeds. So for now, they let her sleep. We'll see if the upcoming prequel comic this October sheds any light. But this brings up a sticking point I've seen for this movie. Easter eggs and references. Do they belong in an Alien movie? Can you have too many of them? I think the Ripley example is so subtle, and it's really the kind of thing you only discover on multiple viewings. But blatant references. Andy saying he prefers the term artificial person, just like Bishop says in Aliens.
I prefer the term artificial person myself.
Or probably the one most people catch, and the one I've seen get some of the most vitriol online, when Andy echoes Ripley's famous line,
"Get away from her, you bitch!"
He says it while saving Rain from a xenomorph in the elevator shaft. I can relate to the people who dislike these references because, in a way, they do take me out of the movie. For a moment, it feels like the characters have become Deadpool, breaking the fourth wall and winking at the audience. And it's not just references, but the handling of major plot points can feel similar, like the reveal that Chief Science Officer Rook is apparently a similar model as Ash from the Nostromo. This one was particularly surprising because, of course, sadly, Ian Holm passed away a few years ago. I actually love that they brought back his likeness. I generally do not think it works to resurrect a deceased actor through digital effects, but it works better for a synthetic character. He doesn't have to look entirely human. The voice can be heavily modified since the machine is damaged, and the Uncanny Valley actually works in this particular character's favor. Before the reveal, though, we see the synthetic's body, but his face is always in shadow, or the camera angles conspicuously avoid showing it. The movie is very aware that we are curious whose face that synthetic is wearing. In these moments, the camera isn't motivated by character's point of view, but is specifically motivated by the audience. It's winking at us again, like saying, "I know you're curious who this synthetic is. Just wait, I'll show you in a bit." These moments take me out of the movie slightly. I do prefer a more grounded approach, but I can't honestly say it bothered me that much. In fact, the amount of hate I've seen online makes me want to defend it just because it feels like such an overreaction, especially when I see people who seem like they're angry at other people for enjoying the references. I saw one post that was aghast that audiences clapped at some of the references. That's a feeling I would have had when I was younger, back in my judgmental teens, when I felt smart because I liked Quentin Tarantino and Christopher Nolan. I remember with shame making fun of a friend of mine because he wanted to see the new Scooby-Doo movie. He just wanted to have a good time, and I couldn't let him have it. This now is me atoning for that. If you hear, "Get away from her, you bitch," and you want to clap, go right ahead. Clap like a seal and eat up the Hollywood slop, you ignorant. Okay. At the end of the day, the answer is nuanced. For a 50-year-old franchise, some winking at the audience can be a fun celebration of everything that came before, but you don't want to be too blatant, and you don't want to do it too much. Does Romulus go too far? Mileage will vary. For me, I would have liked a tad less, but it's a nitpick. Alright, I've been beating around the bush, because more than the references, there is something else controversial in this movie. The Offspring. Chronologically, the first human-alien hybrid in the timeline, but not the first in the franchise. Of course, Resurrection did it first. But before we talk about the creature itself, we have to talk about how we got there. Prometheus. I kinda love that choice. Like I said before, you could take the easy way out and erase from canon the more controversial entries in a franchise, but I have to respect the movie for not only acknowledging Prometheus, but actually embracing it. Personally, I appreciate that because I loved some of the ideas in that movie, just not the execution. Perfect for me, Romulus brings back a couple of those ideas with generally better execution. The black goo. Again, I prefer xenomorphs with a more enigmatic origin, but I think Romulus still leaves it somewhat ambiguous, because there's that question, the chicken or the egg. Rook extracted the black goo from facehuggers. Maybe that's where engineers got it to begin with. What came first, the goo or the facehuggers? Focusing on the actual plot, It felt like a logical extension of Prometheus. Of course, Weyland-Yutani would want to harness the beneficial aspects of the black substance, a plot point actually covered in the comic I talked about recently, and also identical to Carlton Drake's plan in Venom, where he wants to harness the symbiote so humans can live in space. Actually, Venom is sort of gooey and black. You don't think. You know what? Let's not give them any ideas. So I generally like what they did with the substance here. I only have 2 nitpicks. 1, the reveal feels very reveal-y. The way it's staged with them walking into a room, what is that stuff? The villain pops on screen to give his villain monologue explaining everything. It felt like something out of a cheesy superhero movie. And my second nitpick, Kay deciding to inject herself. 2 issues. 1, she has no idea what that stuff is. She wasn't with them in the lab. Her only exposure to it is that after she's rescued, Tyler begs Andy to help her. Andy holds up the syringe and says, 25% of the human genome is shared with rats, and it worked on a rat. Tyler considers injecting it into her until Rain stops him. She doesn't trust it. From context, Kay, I'm sure, can tell this stuff is dangerous, but has a shot at helping her. It's clearly a long shot, and it's based on context clues with no real information about what that stuff is. I cannot get myself into the headspace of someone who decides to take that injection unless they're desperate enough. And I needed the movie to give me more desperation. I needed to see Kay try and reach the cryopod, see that she can't make it, and this stuff in that syringe is her only hope. Instead, Rain leaves her on the elevator, and moments later, Kay takes the injection. Okay, so a couple of nitpicks with how we got there, but once we're there, once that cocoon comes out of Kay, I was on board. Every monster this movie has thrown at me previously was amazing and terrifying, the best looking xenomorphs I've seen. So I was anticipating whatever that cocoon would birth. This was the first time Romulus gave me a degree of that sense of unknown I haven't really felt with this series since the original. And then we see it. The beautiful abomination. I love how you can see some engineer in its face. The implications of that are interesting. Were the engineers born of the same substance as the xenomorphs? Actually, it sounds like that's how Fede Alvarez thought of it. Here's a quote from his interview with Variety. The black goo is the root of the whole thing that was introduced in Prometheus. It's the root of all life. But also particularly the xenomorphs come out of that thing, which means it has to be inside them. If it affects your DNA, and the engineers clearly came out of the same root of life, it made complete sense to me that the offspring of a human and a xenomorph was going to look like that. Theories aside, just viscerally, it is so creepy and disturbing, the way it almost looks like it's smiling. And yes, it has the face of an engineer, which also looks pretty human, but you don't see human in its eyes. You see a monster. Rain's battle against it plays like an extended version of Ripley's battle with the xenomorph at the end of Alien. Rain even sneaks into a compartment to quietly suit up and strap herself in to prepare for depressurization. But this movie cranks up the intensity. Alvarez was influenced by the game Alien Isolation, and you really feel it here. That game did such a good job of capturing the first-person POV of flying through space and how terrifying that would be, knowing if you let go, you are simply trapped in the abyss. This movie does that too. We watch from Rain's perspective as she's launched out of the ship. The offspring grabs onto her and gets in her face, and when the cargo module flies off, it feels just as chaotic as it should, because we see it all as if we're looking through her eyes. It was an intense finale to an almost 2-hour thrill ride. I love this movie, and it is awesome to be optimistic about the Alien franchise again. I'd love a sequel, and it sounds like Alvarez is approaching it with the proper attitude. He doesn't want to rush it. He points out how Aliens didn't come until 7 years after Alien. You have to walk away for a bit and give people time to miss it. And in the meantime, we have the Alien Earth TV series coming next year from Noah Hawley. Based on his track record, we know at minimum it's going to be something bold and creative, so I can't wait. Apparently, if you watch Romulus at a Regal Cinema in the US, they're airing an Alien Earth teaser, which you can also find online pretty easily. Which means I need to stay in space for a while to avoid spoilers. In fact, I'll probably just put myself in cryo sleep until Alien Earth comes out. Stay tuned, there's more Alien content on the way. I'll be adding Romulus to the timeline at some point. I'll also do that extended timeline, adding the Predator, Alien vs. Predator, and Blade Runner movies, and more. For now, thank you for watching, and see you on the next One Take.